Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was driving through Fremont Canyon on my way back to Rock Springs after visiting a friend in Casper. It was close to midnight, the kind of cold Wyoming night where your headlights feel swallowed by the dark. The road cut between tall rock walls, and the sky above narrowed into a thin ribbon. My radio kept losing signal, so I had it off, leaving only the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle from the wind hitting the truck. I'd driven that stretch a dozen times before, but something about the darkness that night made it feel different, heavier, like the canyon was absorbing sound instead of echoing it. I was maybe 15 miles from Alcova when it happened. The sky ahead glowed pale green. It wasn't bright, not like lightning or headlights. It was soft, almost hazy, but unmistakable. The glow spread across the canyon's narrow opening, illuminating the rock walls for about 2 seconds. The color wasn't natural, too even, too muted like the light behind a frosted screen. My foot eased off the gas without me deciding to do it. The glow didn't pulse or shift. It simply held for a moment, then thinned out and dissolved, fading back into darkness. I kept rolling forward at maybe 40 miles per hour, staring ahead, expecting another flash, but everything stayed black. The sky returned to normal. The canyon walls turned back into vague shapes only outlined by my headlights. I waited for thunder, nothing. I waited for the sound of a plane, nothing. Just silence. Then I noticed the dashboard clock. 12:41 a.m. I blinked at it. I was certain it had said 12:36 when I'd entered the canyon, and that was maybe 3 minutes earlier. I checked my phone on the passenger seat, tapping it awake. 12:36. 5 minutes difference. The truck clock had jumped ahead. I tried to reason it out. Maybe the truck had reset itself, but that made no sense. It had never done that before, not even after battery issues. And the time wasn't random. It was ahead by 5 minutes. Perfectly 5. Not 3:17 or 1:50 or some nonsense default. I kept driving, my pulse a little faster now. The canyon walls seemed closer than usual, like they were leaning inward. My headlights caught a few reflective signs, but even those felt dim. About a mile later, the engine sound changed. Not louder or weaker, just different. Like the air around the truck had shifted density. I pressed the gas and the RPM needle responded normally, but the sound had this hollow undertone to it, as if echoing off something I couldn't see. The truck vibrated once, a small, controlled vibration, almost like hitting a patch of rough pavement. But the road was smooth, freshly paved last summer. I ran my hand along the steering wheel and could feel a faint, lingering buzz that shouldn't have been there. Ahead of me, the canyon opened slightly, giving a wider view of the sky. I expected the green glow again, but the sky was pitch black. That's when I noticed the stars. They were wrong. Not gone, there were a few, but they looked blurred, smeared slightly, like I was seeing them through heat distortion. But the air was freezing, crisp enough that breath fogged instantly. There was no heat rising off the canyon floor, nothing that should have distorted light. The distortion moved, very slowly, from left to right. A drifting patch of warped air, almost imperceptible unless I focused. It didn't catch the light of my headlights or interact with the canyon walls. It was just this soft ripple overhead, like a transparent sheet being pulled taut. I stared too long. The truck drifted slightly toward the center line and I jerked the wheel back. My chest tightened with sudden adrenaline. When I looked up again, the distortion was gone. The stars were just stars, but the canyon was silent again. No wind, no engine echo, no gravel under the tires. Just a suffocating, empty quiet. When I finally exited the canyon, the normal sounds of the world rushed back. The engine hummed properly, the tires hummed on pavement, even a distant truck on the opposite side of the river sounded crisp and present. The pressure in my head eased without me noticing at first. I checked the dashboard clock again. 12:48, 12:39. 9 minutes different now. I didn't like that. The rest of the drive to Rock Springs felt uneasy. Every few minutes, I'd check the sky in the mirrors, half convinced the pale green light would appear behind me. It didn't. The road stayed dark, quiet, ordinary. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself it had been some strange aurora or a freak weather thing. Something explainable, something boring. Except when I parked and turned the truck off, the dashboard clock flickered. Just once. A tiny dimming, the same soft dip I'd seen in my neighbor's backyard camera earlier this year, the same kind of glitch that didn't feel like a glitch. The clock reset itself. 12:39, matching my phone exactly. I sat there in the dark cab, breathing into cold hands, staring at the now correct numbers glowing faintly on the dash. For a moment I thought about turning the truck back on, driving the canyon again to see if anything happened. But the thought of being back between those rock walls with that empty silence and that impossible green glow made my skin crawl. Instead, I went inside, turned on every light in the living room, and sat on the couch replaying the moment the sky brightened. One soft, narrow flash of pale green, bright enough to paint the canyon walls, but too contained, too precise, too aware. I didn't sleep much, and the next morning when I checked the truck clock again before work, it was 5 minutes ahead. I was lying on my back in a field just outside of Gunnison, Colorado, the kind of place where the stars actually look like stars and not washed out dots behind streetlights. It was late September, around 11:40 p.m., cold enough that my jacket wasn't quite doing its job. I'd driven out there after work because the sky was supposed to be clear, and I hadn't had a good night of stargazing in a long time. The field belonged to an old coworker named Travis, who didn't mind me parking by the fence as long as I kept the gate closed. There was no moon that night, just grass, the faint outline of the mountains, and the sky stretching out forever. I had my small folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and one of those star map apps open on my phone. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No cars, no neighbors, not even cows in the distance. Just the soft breeze and the occasional creak from the fence behind me. I was scanning the east side of the sky, looking at a cluster of stars above the ridge, when one of them moved. Not a shooting star, not a satellite. This one moved sideways, then up a little, then down, all within this tight little loop, like someone drawing a tiny circle with a pen. It was small, maybe the size of my thumb's nail at arm's length. Bright, but not unusually bright. I blinked several times, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Sometimes, if you stare too long, you get that drifting sensation. But the other stars around it stayed perfectly still. Only that one point of light was moving. I sat up straighter and squinted. The star kept circling, not smoothly either. It had this oddly mechanical precision. The motion was too perfect, too controlled, like a compass needle spinning around a point. No flickering, no fading. It just traced the same circle over and over, small and tight. I pulled out my phone and tried to line the screen up with the sky to see if the app could identify the star. Before I could even lock onto the spot, the star snapped back into place. Instantly. Not gradually drifting back, not easing into its old position. One moment it was looping, the next it was sitting exactly where it had been originally, as if someone had let go of it and it snapped back like a rubber band. The hairs on my arms stood up. I lowered my phone. The spot was crowded with other stars now, and I couldn't figure out which one had moved. They all looked normal, perfectly normal. My breath started fogging in front of me, and only then did I realize how fast I was breathing. I leaned forward and stared at that section of the sky for a long time. Nothing else moved. But the silence around me had changed. I didn't hear the wind anymore, or the distant hum of the highway. The whole field felt sealed off, the way a room feels when a door is quietly closed behind you. I looked around. Nothing unusual. My truck sat about 20 feet behind me. The grass swayed gently. The mountains were dark and still, but something felt wrong. I checked the time on my phone, 11:56 p.m. That didn't make sense. It had been 11:40 something when I first noticed the movement, and the whole thing hadn't lasted more than 2 minutes. I must have stared longer than I thought, but 16 minutes? My coffee was still hot, my legs hadn't gone numb, and I didn't remember anything except those few moments watching the sky. I tried to shake it off. I'm not the type to jump to weird conclusions. I told myself it was fatigue, or maybe the cold messing with my perception. But part of me couldn't stop thinking about the precision of that movement. the way it stopped exactly where it started. I sat back down and kept watching the sky. The stars were steady. A plane passed overhead eventually, blinking the way planes do. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed something else. To my right, near the edge of the field, the grass was moving, only in one spot. It wasn't the wind. The rest of the field was barely stirred. But that one patch, maybe a 10-foot circle, swayed gently, rhythmically, like something was passing just above it. I stood up again. The movement stopped immediately. I took a step closer to the fence. The patch looked just like the rest of the field now. Still, dark, untouched. I waited. After maybe 30 seconds, the grass in that same circle dipped slightly, as if pressed by a faint weight. Not flattened, not trampled. Just depressed, like a hand lightly pushed down on it from above. Then it rose again. I felt that pressure shift in my ears, the kind you get before a storm or when a plane changes altitude. A subtle pop, like the air was adjusting around me. I backed away from the fence. Then the sky brightened. Not much, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. A dim wash of white spread across the tree line for a moment, coming from no clear source. Not moonlight, not headlights. It wasn't strong enough to cast shadows. It hung there, almost translucent. I looked up at the stars again. The one that had circled before looked different, not brighter, just more prominent somehow, as if my eyes were drawn to it without trying. And as soon as I focused on it, the air around me felt thicker, heavy. My heartbeat felt louder than it should have. I reached for my phone to check the time again. 12:09 a.m., another 13 minutes gone. I hadn't moved. I hadn't looked away from the field except to glance at that one star. But the time had jumped forward again, smoothly like nothing had happened. My phone didn't freeze. The battery hadn't drained. It was just ahead. I folded my chair, threw it into the truck bed, and got into the cab. I didn't slam the door. I didn't want noise. I didn't want anything drawing attention. I started the engine and kept the headlights pointed at the field while I took a few deep breaths. The patch of grass wasn't moving anymore. But something else caught my eye. The star, the one that had moved, was no longer in the same arrangement as the app showed earlier. It was just slightly off position, not enough that someone unfamiliar with the sky would notice, but enough that I knew. It shifted, not a lot, just the smallest flicker of motion, but this time it didn't circle. It drifted half an inch to the left in my vision and snapped right back. I drove away. Slowly at first, then faster once I hit the county road. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't look at the sky. I just kept going until I reached the lights of town. When I got home, first thing I checked was the sky again from my balcony. The stars looked normal, completely normal. I couldn't even tell which one it had been. My phone read 12:43 a.m. The microwave said 12:26. The stove, 12:27. The wall clock, 12:27. I didn't fix any of them. And I haven't gone stargazing alone since. I was lying in bed around 1:30 in the morning, the kind of late where you're not fully awake but not really asleep either. It had been a long day at work, and I was hoping to drift off quickly. My house is small, a one-story place in a quiet neighborhood in Fairview, Missouri, so I usually notice every sound, every creak, every little thing the house does at night. Nothing ever feels out of the ordinary. But that night, something did. I felt a vibration through the floorboards. It wasn't strong. If anything, it was too soft, like someone lightly dragging something heavy across the ground outside, but muffled, distant. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I opened my eyes, thinking maybe a big truck was rumbling down the street, but there was no sound. The vibration didn't match any vehicle I'd ever felt, and around here you can hear a diesel engine well before you feel it. When the vibration stopped, the house went strangely silent. No refrigerator hum, no air returns clicking on, nothing. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. I got out of bed and stood still for a moment, trying to see if the floor would shake again. It didn't, but the quiet felt off, heavy. I walked to the window, not even sure what I expected to see. The blinds were halfway open from earlier in the night, so I peeked through. A dim light was drifting above the rooftops across the street. At first, I thought it was a drone. People fly them around here sometimes, but this was moving too slowly, almost like it was floating. Pale, almost colorless, like the glow from a phone screen seen through frosted glass. It didn't pulse or blink. It wasn't a street lamp reflection or car headlights. The angle was too high, and the street was empty. The light glided from the right side of my neighbor's house toward the left, keeping a straight, steady path maybe 20 or 30 feet above their roof. It didn't cast shadows, didn't brighten anything around it. It was like the glow existed only on its surface, not radiating outward the way real light does. I lifted the blinds a little higher for a better look. The light changed direction, not sharply, not like it noticed me. It just gently arced upward, as if riding a warm air current, even though the night was cold and still. It tilted slightly, the way a balloon might if caught in a breeze, but its movement was too controlled, too deliberate. I pressed my forehead to the glass without thinking. The vibration came again, shorter this time, just a single soft tremor that traveled up through the floor, into my legs, and then vanished. It didn't feel mechanical. It felt atmospheric, like pressure shifting. My ears popped, even though I hadn't moved. Outside, the drifting light paused. Not completely. It was still moving, but slower, like something was resisting it. Then it slid upward into the air, rising at a steady pace until it was well above the rooftops. Higher and higher without speeding up. Once it reached a point about twice the height of the utility poles, it stopped again. It hung there, completely still. I should have grabbed my phone to record it, but the thought didn't even cross my mind until later. In that moment, all I wanted was to understand what I was looking at. The light dimmed, not in a fade, more like it collapsed inward, shrinking in brightness without shrinking in size. If you've ever seen a flashlight inside a closed fist, the way the glow can look muted but still present, that's the closest comparison I can think of. And then it drifted backward, away from the neighborhood. No acceleration, no sound. Just a steady retreat, like it was being pulled. It passed over the tree line, growing fainter the farther it moved. For a moment, I thought it had vanished entirely, but I could barely make out a pale shape against the dark sky, like a smudge of light moving with purpose. Then it flickered. Not like a bulb burning out, more like something interfering with it. The light stretched slightly, almost vertically, then blinked out all at once. The sky went back to normal. I stayed at the window for a long time, hoping the light would come back, or that I'd see a plane or helicopter that could explain it. Nothing, just the familiar orange glow from the street lamp, 2 houses down, and the faint white porch lights scattered across the neighborhood. Eventually I stepped back and realized the house sounds had returned. The fridge humming, the vents clicking, the normal nighttime noises. I hadn't noticed when they came back. I checked the time on my alarm clock. 1:47 a.m. That didn't match what I expected. I felt like maybe 10 minutes had passed since I first felt the vibration. But the clock said nearly 20. I grabbed my phone. 1:41 a.m., 6-minute difference. I unplugged the alarm clock and plugged it back in. It reset properly. The time synced up with my phone instantly. I waited to see if it would jump ahead again, but it stayed normal. I tried to go back to bed, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt that soft tremor again. Not physically, just in my memory, the way it seemed to move through the house without any sound to go with it. Around 3 a.m., I got up and looked outside again. The rooftops were empty. The sky was dark. Everything looked like any other night. The next morning, when I took the trash out, I looked toward the spot where the light had first appeared. Nothing unusual, just the same houses, the same trees, the same quiet street. But the air felt different. Not colder, not windy. Just different, like stepping into a room where someone had rearranged things when you weren't looking, even if you couldn't say what. I still don't know what caused that vibration through the floorboards, or why the house went silent, or where the drifting light came from. I just know it didn't behave like anything I've ever seen in the sky. I was taking one of my late-night walks, the kind I do when I can't sleep and the house feels too quiet. It was around 12:45 a.m., cold enough that I could see my breath, but not so cold that it hurt to be outside. I'd thrown on a jacket and headed down Birchwood Lane, the street behind my apartment complex in Maple Ridge, a little town most people only pass through on their way somewhere else. The neighborhood is old, small houses, sagging fences, patched driveways. At night, everything gets washed out in that yellow streetlight glow that makes distance hard to judge. I usually make a loop around the block and come back, letting my mind settle. About halfway down the street, I noticed something hovering near the power lines. A small white orb, not bright, not flickering, more like the soft glow of a nightlight, just hanging there above the sagging cables. At first, I honestly thought it was a reflector someone had stuck on a pole or maybe a blown out bulb in one of the street lamps, but it wasn't attached to anything. It floated a few inches above the line, perfectly centered between two leaning poles. I kept walking toward it, trying not to stare, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. I've learned the hard way that sometimes when something weird happens, your brain tries to explain it away before you even get a chance to think. But this orb didn't match anything I knew. It didn't illuminate the wires beneath it, didn't cast any glow on the air around it. It was just a self-contained sphere of white light, no bigger than a baseball. I slowed down without meaning to. The orb stayed perfectly still. No movement, no vibration, no sound. Not even that faint electrical hum you sometimes hear around transformers. The rest of the street was quiet too. Too quiet. There were no crickets, no distant traffic, nothing. The air felt like it had thickened somehow. I stopped a few houses away and pretended to tie my shoelace so I could look at it longer without feeling stupid. That's when I noticed something unsettling. Whenever I looked directly at it, the orb didn't move at all. Absolutely still, like it was pinned to the sky. But when I looked away, just shifted my eyes to the side, toward a tree or a porch light, the orb drifted a few inches along the wire, smoothly, effortlessly, like it only allowed itself to move when I wasn't fully watching. I tested it, turned my head slightly, keeping the orb in my peripheral vision. It moved again. Just an inch or two, but enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. It glided along the length of the power line for a few seconds, then stopped the moment I focused my eyes on it. Each time I looked away, it changed position. Each time I looked directly, it froze. I felt a pressure in my chest, the kind you get when your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The street felt unfamiliar now, like the layout had shifted. I took a step backward. The orb didn't move this time, not even when I looked away. It stayed fixed in place above the power line, quiet and harmless looking. But a feeling crept up my spine, something like being watched, even though the orb had no features, no directionality, nothing that suggested it could see anything at all. I turned around and started walking back the way I came. Not fast, but faster than before. After a few seconds, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over my shoulder. The orb was closer. Not by a lot, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but definitely closer than where I'd first noticed it. It still hovered above the wire, but now it was positioned almost over the middle of the street rather than the edge. It hadn't made any sound. I hadn't felt anything tremble, but it had moved while I wasn't looking. I faced forward again and kept walking, my hands starting to sweat inside my pockets despite the cold. I didn't want to run, not in case it triggered something, not in case this thing reacted to sudden movement. I tried to keep my steps even. Every so often, I glanced sideways, not directly at the orb, but toward the houses using my peripheral vision. Each time, the orb was in a slightly different place, a little farther down the street, a little more centered, a little lower above the wire. By the time I reached the corner where Birchwood meets Aspen Avenue, the orb had drifted nearly halfway down the block, hovering maybe a foot above the power line now. It didn't wobble or jerk. Its movements were too smooth, too controlled. I didn't turn onto Aspen. Instead, I made a hard right onto the footpath that cut between yards toward my apartment building. The moment I stepped off the street, the neighborhood's sounds came back all at once. Distant cars, a dog bark, the hum of someone's porch light. It was so sudden that I actually flinched. I stopped walking. The orb's absence felt wrong, like stepping out of a room where someone had been staring at you. I took one more look back toward Birchwood Lane. The orb wasn't there, not on the power line, not above the street, not anywhere, just normal darkness, normal rooftops, normal silence. I hurried the rest of the way home, locked the door behind me, sat on the couch for a long time before even taking off my jacket. When I finally checked the time on my phone, it said 1:07 a.m. That threw me. My walk had started at 12:45. I'd only been gone maybe 15 minutes at most, judging by the distance and how much time I'd spent standing still. But 22 minutes had passed. The difference wasn't huge, but it felt wrong, like the clock had jumped when I wasn't paying attention. I checked my microwave clock, 1:01, my stove clock, 1:07, the living room wall clock, 1:07 exactly. Only one was behind. The microwave. I didn't reset it. I just sat there replaying the moment the orb moved, only when I wasn't watching, always stopping when I looked straight at it. Like it didn't want to be seen changing positions. I tried going back the next night, same time, same route. Nothing. Just an ordinary quiet street under ordinary power lines. But sometimes, when I walk past Birchwood during the day, I catch myself looking up at the wires, half expecting that small white glow to be waiting there, perfectly still, pretending it had never moved at all. I was driving home from my cousin's place in Dwight, Illinois, after staying later than I meant to. It was close to 11:20 p.m., one of those warm June nights where the air feels heavy but not uncomfortable. The two-lane county road I was on cut through miles of flat farmland, corn on one side, soybeans on the other, the fields stretching out like dark blankets in every direction. No streetlights, no houses, just the occasional mailbox that looked abandoned even in daylight. I had the radio off because my speakers had started crackling earlier that week, so it was just the engine, the tires, and that soft hum the car makes at around 50 miles an hour. My headlights carved out maybe 50 yards in front of me before the darkness swallowed everything again. That's when I noticed the glow, a dull red light hanging low over a distant field on my right side. At first I thought it had to be farm equipment, maybe a combine or tractor outlay, but the glow was too steady. No flicker, no movement, no reflection off metal. Just this muted red spot floating above the horizon, maybe 15 or 20 feet off the ground. I slowed down a little without meaning to. The glow didn't brighten anything around it. That was what struck me first. If someone had hung a lantern or installed a red floodlight, the ground beneath it, the tops of the crops, the dirt, anything, should have reflected something. But the field stayed pitch black. The light existed only around itself, as if the air was glowing, but the world beneath it refused to. I drove a little farther, watching it out of the corner of my eye. It stayed in the same place relative to the road, which meant it was probably a good distance out, maybe a quarter mile or more. Still low. Still dull. Still very wrong. As I got closer to the stretch of road that lined up with it, my radio flickered on for a second. Just static. No station. Then it shut off again, like someone had tapped the power button. The dashboard lights dimmed for a moment. Not much, just enough to notice. Then they returned to normal. I slowed to maybe 40 and rolled the window down to listen. The air felt different sticking my arm out, warmer, somehow, like the wind itself had changed temperature. The glow stayed still, perfectly still. No sway from wind, no shift in brightness. It looked almost like a dying ember floating in midair, but without any smoke or heat distortion around it. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. My car idled quietly. The engine clicks you get when it's cooling down after a long drive started too quickly, like the temperature had changed more than it should have. I leaned forward over the steering wheel, trying to get a better angle through the windshield. The red glow didn't move. For a moment, I thought maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was a distant cell tower light and I just couldn't see the pole. But I'd driven that route for years. I knew every silo, every barn, every tower. Nothing was out there but fields. I stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my shoes, but the rest of the farmland was silent. No insects humming, no breeze through the crops. The kind of silence that feels thick, like something pressing on your ears. The red glow pulsed. Not brighter, just a soft, subtle change, almost like it breathed. Inward, outward. A shift too minor to notice unless you stared. I stared. It lifted, straight up, smoothly. No acceleration, no wobble, no sound. 1 second it hovered low. The next it was rising, a perfect vertical climb like someone had attached it to a string and was pulling it into the sky. Still no illumination on the ground. Still nothing but that isolated red glimmer. I felt my knees go weak, not from fear exactly, but from confusion. My brain scrambled for explanations, drone, flare, reflection, aircraft, but none fit what I was seeing. The glow rose until it was maybe 50 or 60 feet above the field. Then it paused. The silence around me deepened, if that makes any sense, like the world waited for something to happen. The glow shrank, not faded, shrunk, compressed into a smaller and smaller point until it was no bigger than a star. And then, with no sound, no flash, no streak through the sky, it vanished. Gone. The second it disappeared, the insects started up again. A breeze brushed across the road, cool this time, not warm. My ears popped lightly like the cabin pressure in a plane adjusting. I stood by my car door for maybe a minute, scanning the sky for any sign of it. Nothing. The horizon was empty. The crop swayed gently like nothing had happened. I got back in the car. My dashboard clock read 11:54. I frowned at that. The drive from the last intersection, where I'd noted the time at 11:29, should have taken maybe 7 or 8 minutes, not 25. I checked my phone. 11:42. 12-minute difference. My car's clock had jumped ahead. I drove the rest of the way home, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. Every now and then I checked the sky in my mirrors, half expecting that red glow to reappear behind me. But the night stayed ordinary. When I pulled into my driveway, the car clock matched my phone exactly again, like nothing had happened. The radio worked fine, the headlights were normal, but when I stepped out and closed the door, there was a faint smell in the air. Ozone. Not strong, just enough that I noticed it. I stood there in my driveway, staring at the empty sky over the cornfields beyond my street, thinking about the glow, the way it rose, the way it left no trace of light below it, and the way the whole night seemed to skip forward while it hovered there. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to hear my own voice trying to explain it. But every time I drive that stretch of road now, I glance toward that same field, just to make sure the air is dark. I woke up to this bright smear of white on the ceiling, the kind that makes you wince before you even understand what you're looking at. And for a second, I thought it was sunlight coming through the blinds, but it was too focused, too circular. I blinked a few times and realized it was my phone's flashlight, pointed straight upward from the nightstand. I don't sleep with the flashlight on. I've never accidentally turned it on in my sleep. My phone has one of those cases with the stiff buttons you have to press deliberately. I reached over and grabbed it. The back was warm, warmer than it ever gets from just charging. The flashlight icon was lit up on the lock screen. When I checked the battery, it had dropped to 17%. I'd plugged it in before bed at 92%. I unplugged the charger cable and plugged it back in, thinking maybe it hadn't seated right overnight. The phone made the charging sound, so it wasn't that. I stood there a moment, confused, staring at the flashlight, still cutting through the room like a spotlight. That's when I noticed something else. The phone's clock said 6:04 a.m., my wall clock said 5:11, and my bedside radio clock said 5:12. I felt this cold crawl up my back. Losing a few minutes between devices is annoying, but normal. Losing almost an hour on only one device, one that had been actively using battery power all night, felt wrong. I shut off the flashlight and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. My apartment in Asheville is usually pretty noisy in the mornings. Pipes creaking, HVAC kicking on, the upstairs neighbors walking around, but everything was unusually quiet. I checked the door, still locked. The windows too, nothing looked disturbed. Still, I had that lingering feeling you get when you wake up from a nightmare you can't remember. Like something had been happening while you were unconscious and your brain was still trying to catch up. I tried to shake it off and went to the kitchen to make coffee. When I set my phone on the counter, the flashlight flipped on again. Not the screen, just the flashlight. I didn't touch anything. My hands weren't even on the phone. It lay flat on the counter with the beam pointed upward like some kind of distress flare. I turned it off. Again. 5 seconds later, it turned on. I picked it up and restarted it. The flashlight stayed off. The battery, though, dropped to 15% almost instantly. I plugged it in again and turned on the overhead light. The kitchen felt too dim, even with the light on. Maybe it was just how unsettled I was. While the coffee brewed, I replayed the night in my head. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was scrolling through a text thread with my friend Melissa, then setting the phone on the nightstand and lying on my side. No calls, no alarms, nothing else scheduled. After coffee, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The sky was a washed-out gray, low fog sitting between the hills. It looked normal at first until I noticed the birds. There weren't any. Usually the trees behind the complex are full of morning sounds, but everything was muted. Not silent exactly, just distant. Like the world outside was a recording being played slightly quieter than it should have been. I went back inside. My phone buzzed, startling me. A notification popped up. Flashlight disabled, temperature too high. I picked it up. The back of the phone was hot again, even though it had only been charging for a few minutes. The battery had climbed to 18%, but the charging icon kept flickering like the phone wasn't sure whether it was plugged in. I checked the usage stats. The flashlight had been on for 2 hours and 13 minutes. That wasn't possible. I'd checked the time. Even if I'd fallen asleep instantly and the flashlight turned on right then, it still didn't line up. And screen on time was listed as almost 0. I put the phone down and looked around my bedroom, half expecting something to be out of place. Everything was where I left it, except the curtain by the window. It was slightly open. I always closed it fully before bed. Not just habit, my window faces the parking lot and the street lamp outside hits the glass at an angle that keeps me awake. But there was a small gap now, maybe 2 inches wide. Small enough that I wouldn't notice unless I looked straight at it. Large enough that something outside could have shined through. I checked the lock on the window. Still latched. Nothing unusual about the frame, but the gap in the curtain bothered me more than the phone did. I pulled it shut again and went back to the living room. My phone buzzed once more. The flashlight was on again. This time I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring, watching the light hit the ceiling. The beam wasn't steady. It flickered, very subtly, but enough that the edges wavered like someone was moving the phone by a millimeter or two, even though it sat still on the table. I picked it up, checked the camera app. It wasn't open. I checked the flashlight setting again. It was just on. No app was using it. I held the phone up and pointed the light at the nearest wall, and I swear the beam wasn't hitting where I expected. Not by much, maybe an inch off. But when you move a flashlight around every day, you learn how it's supposed to behave. This wasn't behaving normally. Then something else hit me. The angle the phone had been lying at on the nightstand meant the flashlight should have lit up the lamp beside my bed, not the ceiling. For it to point upward like that, the phone would have had to be rotated slightly. Not enough to fall off, but enough that someone, or something, would have needed to adjust it. I didn't like that thought. I turned the phone off, completely off, held the power button until it shut down. Then I set it on the couch cushion just to see if it would do anything. It didn't. For a while, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself it was solved. I made breakfast, got dressed, and decided to walk down to the little trail behind my complex just to clear my head. When I got back, the phone was on. Flashlight blazing, pointed at the ceiling again. The battery was at 11%. The room felt warm, like the device had been running non-stop the entire time I was gone. I tapped the screen. The lock screen time said 9:52 a.m. My microwave clock said 9:31. My stove said 9:32. 20-minute difference. I didn't bother turning the phone off this time. I just unplugged it, dropped it into a drawer, and shut it inside. The flashlight stayed on, the drawer glowing faintly around the edges. I left it there. I still use that phone. I didn't replace it, mostly because nothing similar has happened since. The flashlight works normally now, the battery holds a charge, the clocks all match. But every once in a while, I'll wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, and the room will be just slightly brighter than it should be. Not enough to see anything clearly, just a faint glow, the kind that reminds me of the beam on the ceiling. When that happens, I don't check the drawer. I don't want to know if the flashlight is on again. I was out on Lake Tahoma with my friend's old aluminum John boat, the same one he let me borrow every summer. It was early August, a warm evening that felt like it was holding onto the day a little too tightly. The sun had just dipped behind the ridge, leaving everything tinted blue and gold at the same time. I wasn't there for anything serious, just trying to catch a few bass before the light was gone. I drifted farther from the dock than I meant to. The lake was calm enough that the boat barely rocked, and I could hear every little sound. Insects buzzing in the reeds, a splash from a trout somewhere behind me, a distant dog barking from one of the rental cabins up the hill. I'd turned my phone on silent and tossed it into the tackle box so I wouldn't be tempted to check it. For a while, everything was completely normal. I remember reeling in after a cast that went too close to a submerged log, wiping my palms on my shorts and thinking I should head back before it got too dark. The ridge blocked the last of the sun, and the lake settled into that dim silvery color it gets right before night takes over. I reached down for the oar I'd left resting against the side of the boat, and that's when I noticed the water beneath me looked brighter than it should. Not a reflection, not moonlight. It was still too early for the moon to be up. The lake itself was glowing, faintly, very faintly. A soft, pale green light, almost like the shine from a glow stick that's been activated for hours. It came from directly under the center of the boat, not near the edges. I leaned forward thinking it was some kind of bioluminescence, maybe stirred up by my drifting, but the glow had shape, not round, not formless, more like a flattened oval, maybe 10 or 12 feet long, slowly brightening and fading in this slow, rhythmic pulse. I knelt and set my hand on the edge of the boat, steadying myself. The water wasn't moving any differently. There were no bubbles rising, no disturbance at all, just the steady pulse of that soft glow. I told myself it had to be some kind of reflection. Maybe one of the houses nearby had turned on a bright light. I glanced toward the shore. Everything was dark. Not a porch light, not a lantern, nothing. When I looked back down, the glow began drifting, not spreading, not rising, just sliding away from the boat in a perfectly straight line. I watched it pass under the surface, moving at a walking pace toward the deeper part of the lake. It didn't waver, didn't curve, just a steady, deliberate path. The glow dimmed slightly as it moved, but didn't distort the water at all. I grabbed the oar, but didn't paddle. Part of me was scared to follow, scared to get closer. The rest of me wanted to keep the boat perfectly still in case movement scared whatever it was. As the glowing shape moved farther away, I noticed something else. The insects had gone silent. I hadn't realized how constant the buzzing had been until it suddenly wasn't there. No frogs, no rustling from the reeds. Even the distant dog stopped barking. The air felt heavy, thick enough that breathing took a conscious effort. The glow continued its path across the lake, still straight, still steady. When it reached a point about 30 yards from the boat, it began to dim faster, shrinking as it did. Not sinking, just shrinking like someone was turning down a dial. Then it went out completely. The silence held for another few seconds. Then the sounds came back all at once. The frogs croaking, the insects starting up again, the distant barking returning like someone unmuted the world. I sat there gripping the oar so tightly my fingers hurt. The water lapped at the sides of the boat in the exact same pattern as before, like nothing had happened. I checked my watch. It said 8:19 p.m. That startled me. I checked it right before the glow appeared, and it had been 8:11. The whole thing felt like it lasted maybe 30 seconds. A minute, tops. Not 8. I assumed I misremembered. I even tapped the face of the watch like that would make time reverse. I pulled my phone out of the tackle box, 8:19 p.m. Both matched. I looked out toward where the glow had vanished, waiting for something to reappear. Ripples, bubbles, even a shadow. But the lake was perfectly flat. I told myself to leave. I even dipped the oar into the water and started rowing back toward the dock. The entire way, my eyes kept darting to the water, half expecting that soft green light to appear under the boat again. It didn't. But about halfway back, the surface of the lake rippled in a line. A perfect straight line, almost like a seam opening and closing. Not a fish. Not wind. A smooth, ruler-straight disturbance that traveled maybe 10 feet before disappearing. I stopped rowing. The water stilled almost immediately. That was enough for me. I rowed the rest of the way as fast as I could without tipping the boat. When I reached the dock, my hands were trembling. I tied the boat off, grabbed my tackle box, and looked back over the lake one last time. The surface was dark and calm. No glow, no strange ripples, just a normal lake at dusk. On the walk to my car, I checked my watch again, 8:27 p.m. I'd gotten back in what felt like 2 minutes. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. My radio crackled with static on stations that usually came in clearly. My headlights flickered once when I turned onto my road. Everything felt a little off. I didn't tell anyone for a couple days. When I finally brought it up to my friend Travis, the one who owned the boat, he shrugged and said, "Lakes do weird stuff sometimes." I agreed, because it was easier than explaining the silence, the straight line movement, the missing minutes. But I haven't gone fishing at dusk since. And every time I drive past the lake at night, I catch myself looking out over the water, waiting for that faint green glow to slide through the darkness again. The alert on my phone woke me up, a motion notification from the security camera over my driveway. It was 2:13 a.m. I don't usually check them in the middle of the night unless there's a second alert, but for some reason, I opened it anyway. Maybe I'd been half awake already. Maybe something in the house felt off. I don't know. The thumbnail on the notification showed nothing unusual. Just my driveway, my car, the usual grainy nighttime view. But when I tapped the video, the first second of footage was completely washed out, pure white. Not like a spotlight hitting the camera, not like headlights, just a full-screen flash that erased the scene entirely. Then the video cut back to normal. My driveway, quiet, empty. The porch railing, a plastic bin I still hadn't taken to the shed. I scrubbed back through the timeline. The timestamp went from 2:13:10:04 to 2:13:11 with no gap showing. The footage didn't show anything between those numbers, just jumped ahead like the camera had blinked. 7 seconds missing. I sat up in bed, fully awake now. The house was dark, the kind of dark where you can't tell the difference between having your eyes open or closed. I listened for something. Footsteps, a thud, anything. But the only sound was the fridge humming faintly down the hall. I replayed the clip 3 or 4 times, trying to catch something in the edges of the flash. There was nothing. Just a white frame and an empty driveway afterward. After a minute, I got up and went to look out the living room window. The street was still, no cars, no movement. A slight fog hung low over the yards, which didn't match the weather app at all. It said clear skies. I checked the camera feed again in real time. Everything looked normal. Before going back to bed, I walked to the front door and made sure the deadbolt was locked. My fingers hesitated on the metal for a second. It felt colder than the rest of the door. I finally tried to sleep, but it didn't take. I kept thinking about the white flash and the missing seconds. Eventually, I gave up and went to the kitchen for water. When I passed the thermostat, I noticed the temperature had dropped 2 degrees since I'd gone to bed. Not impossible, just weird. I hadn't heard the AC kick on, and the house usually keeps steady overnight. I poured the water, drank about half, and walked back toward the bedroom. That's when I saw the glow through the blinds. Not bright, more like a faint smear of white that moved across my lawn, quick and soft like someone swinging a flashlight from far away. I froze. The glow didn't pass over the windows again. It didn't come from a car. It didn't reflect anywhere else. I waited a long moment before pulling the blinds up an inch. Nothing. Just the street, the fog, the neighbor's fence barely visible. I put my hand on the glass. The window pane vibrated, very lightly, almost nothing, but definitely there. It reminded me of standing near a generator or a transformer, except there was no sound to go with it. Just the vibration. I stepped back. The vibration stopped instantly. I checked the camera again. The driveway looked normal. The street looked normal. The timestamp was moving normally now. No jumps, no glitches. I stayed awake another hour or so, sitting on the couch, staring at the live feed. Nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I fell asleep right there. In the morning, I downloaded the night's footage. Every clip was there except the flash one. The file existed, but when I tapped it, the app spun for several seconds before telling me it couldn't load the video. The thumbnail still showed that white frame, but the playback was broken. I transferred the raw footage to my laptop to try again. Same result. I checked the timestamp log. It went from 2:13:04 straight to 2:13:11, exactly as I'd seen. The camera hadn't recorded anything during that flash. Or maybe it had, and the system just didn't know what to do with it. Before I left for work, I stood on the driveway and looked up at the camera. The lens had a faint film on it, like condensation, but only on the outer edges, as if something had heated or cooled the center of the lens unevenly. The rest of the day felt off. My phone kept losing service in places where it never had trouble. My watch buzzed twice with phantom notifications, vibrations with no message behind them. Every digital clock I glanced at felt like it was a minute fast or a minute slow, though when I compared them, they matched perfectly. That night, I reviewed more footage. Nothing unusual until around 9:30 p.m. That's when the camera flickered, just once, like a skipped frame. Not a flash, not a light, just a tiny interruption. No missing timestamp this time. But the flicker felt the same, like something passing in front of the lens too fast to track. At 2:13 a.m. the next night, I stayed awake and watched the feed. Nothing happened. But around 3 a.m., the porch light dimmed. Not by much, just enough to dull the color of the wood railing. It stayed dim for maybe 10 seconds, then brightened again. The camera didn't react to the change. No motion alert, no brightness spike. The algorithm hadn't registered anything unusual at all. I looked out the window. A fog bank was rolling in again, even though the sky overhead was clear enough to see a few stars. The next morning, the camera lens had that same uneven condensation on the edges. I wiped it off, went inside, and checked the video logs. There was a 2-second gap at 3:01 a.m., no flash, no brightening, no alert, just 2 seconds gone. I don't know why things like this always happen in such small pieces. Flashes, gaps, tiny vibrations, quiet distortions. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just little interruptions the world pretends not to notice. The only thing I do know is that the missing time keeps happening. Not every night, but often enough that I've started waking up at random hours, glancing at the camera feed, waiting for another white frame to erase the world for a moment. I was camping alone in the Bitterroot Range, not far from an old trailhead my uncle used to take me to when I was a kid. I picked a small clearing near a creek, flat enough for my tent, far enough from the water that I wouldn't wake up freezing. It was late September, cool but not cold, and the air smelled like pine sap and damp dirt. I'd gotten there late in the afternoon and spent most of the daylight setting up camp and collecting deadfall for the fire. By the time I finished eating, the sun had dropped behind the ridge. The sky was still light, but the forest itself had already turned dark, that kind of soft, shadowy darkness where everything looks like it's holding its breath. I remember poking at the fire with a stick, listening to the usual forest sounds, crickets, the creek, occasional rustling from small animals. Then it all stopped. Not gradually, not fading, everything just ceased. The creek still ran, but even that seemed quieter somehow, like someone had put a wall between me and the sound. I lifted my head, waiting for the insects to start up again, but the silence stayed thick and absolute. Even the wind, which had been moving the branches overhead a few seconds earlier, was suddenly gone. I sat perfectly still, the stick hovering above the fire. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want whatever caused that silence to notice me. After maybe 30 seconds, I'm guessing since it felt both short and long, I heard a soft, short snap of a twig from deeper in the trees. Not close, not far, not far. Just enough to make my pulse jump. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon or something normal, but the silence made it impossible to believe that. Forest noise cuts out sometimes when predators are nearby, sure, but this felt different, too complete, too controlled. I stood slowly and took a step back from the fire, back closer to my tent. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing in on my ears. I rubbed one of them without thinking. It didn't pop. It didn't relieve anything. Then I saw it. Between two large trees, maybe 20 yards away, something shimmered in the air. At first, I thought it was heat distortion, like the wavy look above asphalt in the summer. But the night air was cold enough that I'd been seeing my own breath moments before. The shimmer wasn't rising or drifting. It just hung there in a vertical patch, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. I leaned slightly to the right. The shimmer shifted with me, not like it was reacting, more like it was layered over the trees, adjusting so that it always stayed directly in my line of sight. If I had taken one more step, I swear it would have still been centered between those two trees. I whispered, "No," without realizing it. The shimmer brightened, only a little, but enough to outline the shape more clearly. It wasn't a shape, exactly, more like a window made of distorted air. A cutout where the forest behind it didn't match the rest of what I was seeing. The background was wrong. Out of focus, but not blurred. Just wrong. I blinked hard. The shimmer pulsed once. Not light, not color. Just a change, like a ripple passing through a thin sheet. The forest stayed silent. I reached for my flashlight, which was clipped to the tent zipper. My fingers brushed it, but something in me refused to actually grab it. I was afraid of what would happen if I pointed a beam at the shimmer, afraid it would respond. Another twig snapped, this one closer, behind the shimmer. I couldn't see anything moving there, but I heard it clearly. Not gradual footsteps, just one deliberate crack of something stepping down. The shimmer flickered, then dissolved, not faded, not moved. It just broke apart like dust being scattered into nothing. The space between the trees returned to normal instantly. The forest sounds didn't return right away. I waited 5, maybe 10 seconds before I heard a single cricket start up again, then another. Then the creak grew louder, like someone slowly turning up a volume knob. When the wind came back, it rustled the branches hard enough that I flinched. Everything went back to normal. I stood there staring at the empty spot between the trees for a long time. I wanted to believe the whole thing was a trick of my eyes, some kind of optical illusion from the firelight, but the silence hadn't been an illusion, and the distortion had reacted when I moved. I finally forced myself to sit back down by the fire. I didn't add more wood. I didn't eat anything else. I just sat there, listening, trying to figure out if I should pack up and hike out in the dark. The trail was narrow and rocky, and I didn't trust myself not to twist an ankle in the panic that would definitely hit once I left the circle of firelight. After maybe 20 minutes, the forest felt normal again. Too normal. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a pine cone, the flap of a moth's wings near the fire, even the steady gurgling of the creek. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started drifting off, the forest would go quiet for 1 or 2 seconds, and I'd snap awake, convinced it was happening again. It never did, not exactly. But around 3 in the morning, I heard something move down by the creek. Not an animal sound, just a single splash, like something lightly touching the water without stepping into it. When the sky finally started turning gray, I broke camp fast. I shoved everything into my pack, barely rolling up the tent. The trail back to my truck felt longer than the hike in. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew that whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen wouldn't be walking behind me like an animal. When I got home that evening, my clothes still smelled like smoke and pine, but the cold knot in my stomach stuck around for days. The forest had gone completely silent again in my memory, perfect and absolute, and my ears kept replaying that stillness. I tried telling my uncle about it the next week when he called to check in. I didn't mention the shimmer at first. I just said the woods had gone quiet. He got serious and said he'd had that happen once, years ago, near a different section of the Bitterroots. He said he didn't stick around long enough to see anything else. I didn't tell him the rest. Even now, when I think about the way that distortion shifted to match my view, I feel the same pressure in my ears that I felt that night, like the air around me remembers. I first heard it while I was washing dishes. It was close to 11 p.m., and I was the only one awake in the house. The window over the sink was cracked open about an inch, just enough to get some cool air moving through the kitchen. I had my hands in soapy water when a low, humming sound rolled over the roof. It wasn't loud, not like a truck or a plane, but it was heavy, deep. It felt more like pressure than noise, like it started inside my ribs instead of outside my ears. I froze with my hands halfway submerged in the sink, trying to pinpoint what direction it was coming from. It seemed to be overhead, not moving, not fading in or out, just holding there, steady and dense. My first thought was that the neighbor's AC unit was failing again, but the tone wasn't right. Their compressor rattled and clanked when it died, but this was smooth, mechanical in a way, but not quite mechanical either. More like a steady vibration pitched low enough to bypass sound entirely. The dishes clinked against the side of the sink when I stepped back. I waited a few seconds, listening. The humming didn't waver. It didn't pulse. It didn't rise or fall. It just hovered above the house in a perfect, unchanging note. I felt it in my chest more than my ears, like the pressure you get underwater, but only in the center of your body. I wiped my hands on a towel, not taking my eyes off the dark window. The hum stayed exactly the same, and something about how still it was made me uneasy. Nothing around here stayed that perfectly consistent. Even wind chimes shifted, planes moved, generators fluctuated. This sound felt intentional. I moved toward the front door slowly, almost like I didn't want whoever or whatever was making the sound to hear me. The floorboards under me vibrated just slightly with each step, not because of my weight, but because the hum was resonating through them. By the time I reached the door, my curiosity had switched to something closer to fear. The hum stayed steady, unchanged, almost like it was waiting. I put my hand on the doorknob and hesitated. Then I turned it. The moment the door opened, even before I stepped outside, the sound cut out completely. Not faded, not moved away, stopped, like someone had switched it off mid-note. The sudden silence made my ears ring. I stood there in the doorway, half expecting the sound to return or for something to appear above me. But the sky was empty, dim with light pollution, but clear enough for me to see a few stars. The trees around the yard shifted gently in the breeze. A dog barked a few houses down, breaking the strange stillness. Nothing looked out of place. I stepped outside, onto the porch. The house behind me felt like it had lost something, like some unseen weight had been lifted. I looked straight up. Nothing. For a minute or so, I stood there scanning the sky, my eyes darting from one patch of darkness to another, trying to catch any hint of movement. I didn't see anything, but my chest still felt tight, like the air hadn't quite returned to normal. Eventually, I walked back inside. The moment the door shut, the house felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. As if all the normal nighttime noises had been dampened somehow. I checked the fridge, the AC, even the ceiling fan to make sure nothing had malfunctioned. Everything was fine. I went back to the dishes, but I couldn't shake the pressure I'd felt in my chest. It lingered, even after the humming was gone, faint but noticeable. I ended up pouring out the sink and abandoning the rest of the dishes. I tried to sleep, but I kept replaying the sound in my head. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. No mechanical stutter, no airflow, no motor whine. Just a perfect, low resonance sitting above the house like a held breath. Around 1:30 a.m., I finally got up and went outside again, just to check. The street was empty. No cars, no planes overhead, no weird humming. But about a block away, one of the street lights flickered in a slow, steady pattern. On for a second, off for a second. I'd never seen it flicker like that before. Usually when those lights go bad, they stutter quickly or buzz. This one was almost rhythmic. I watched it for a minute or two. It kept the same pattern. Steady. Predictable. Too predictable. When I went back inside, I noticed the microwave clock was blinking 12, even though there hadn't been any storm or outage. None of the other appliances had reset, just that one. I pressed a few buttons to set the correct time, but it froze when I reached the minute digits. I had to unplug it to fix it. The next morning felt normal, completely normal. Birds were chirping, traffic sounded the same, and the house didn't feel strange anymore. For a few hours, I convinced myself I'd imagined most of it. Then, around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a missed call notification. No number listed, just a timestamp, 11:03 p.m. That was almost the exact moment the humming had started. I opened the call log. The entry didn't have a number, didn't have a location, didn't even have a duration. Just a blank call with only the time recorded. I tried tapping it, but nothing happened. It wouldn't open, wouldn't delete either. I put the phone down and sat there for a few seconds, staring at it. The pressure in my chest came back, just a faint memory of it, but enough to make me stand up and start pacing the room. The same heaviness, the same quiet dread that had washed over me the night before. That night, I stayed up again, waiting to hear the hum. Part of me hoped it wouldn't come back. Another part worried about what it meant if it didn't. Nothing happened. But at exactly 11:03 p.m., the microwave clock blinked once. Not the whole display, just the colon between the hour and minutes. A single flicker. And for a moment, deep in my chest, I felt that pressure again. A low, almost sound, like something hovering just out of reach. Listening. I woke up with the kind of jolt you get when you're sure someone said your name, even though the room is quiet. It was around 3:20 a.m., the glowing digits on my clock the only thing I could see without sitting up. My heart was already beating too fast, like my body had reacted before my mind caught up. I didn't hear anything at first. No footsteps, no voices, no tapping. but I had this strong, specific feeling that someone had been standing right outside my window. Not walking past it, standing there, close enough that I felt watched even after waking. The house was silent. The air felt still, too still for that hour. Usually I could hear at least a distant car or one of the neighbors' backyard wind chimes, but there was nothing. I pushed the blanket off and sat up slowly. My bedroom window faced the backyard, which opened into a wooded strip the town never bothered to clear. It always made the place feel more private, right? But in that moment it felt like a blind spot, somewhere someone could hide without much effort. I didn't want to pull the blinds open. I don't know why. Some part of me thought if I saw nothing there, the feeling would get worse, not better. But I stood up anyway. The carpet felt unusually cold under my feet. The air felt warmer near the window, like the temperature shifted in pockets around the room. I reached out and touched the glass with my fingertips. It was warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just wrong. The window should have been cold. It had been in the low 40s when I went to bed, and that glass always felt chilly at night. But this felt like it had absorbed heat from something on the outside. I pulled my hand back immediately. I hadn't breathed that whole time without realizing it. When I finally did, the exhale sounded too loud in the quiet room. I lifted one blind slat just enough to peer through the gap. Nothing. The yard looked normal. The old picnic table, the sagging fence, the line of trees behind it. The motion light above the back door wasn't on, which meant nothing had triggered it. No person, no animal. I let the blind fall back into place, but I didn't move away from the window. My fingers still tingled from the warmth. I stood there another minute before checking the glass again with the back of my hand, thinking maybe I imagined it. But no, it was definitely warmer than the surrounding air. And only in a patch about the size of a person's head and shoulders. The rest of the window felt cool. The idea of someone standing that close to the glass made my stomach tighten. I checked the lock, even though I knew it was latched. I pressed it down hard with my thumb until it couldn't go any farther. Then I stepped back and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. Eventually, I heard something. A soft, short creak from the hallway. It could have been the house settling. It could have been anything, but it didn't happen again. I got up and made myself walk the hall anyway, turning on the lights as I went. Kitchen, empty. Living room, empty. Mudroom, empty. I opened the back door and stepped onto the deck. Cold air hit me immediately, biting at my arms. The fog from earlier hadn't lifted much. It hovered low across the yard, making everything look farther away than it was. The kind of fog that seemed to muffle sound and compress space. I walked to the edge of the deck and scanned the grass. No footprints. The ground wasn't muddy, so I didn't expect much, but I still checked the patch under the window. Nothing disturbed. Before I went back inside, something caught my eye out by the tree line. A faint glow. Very faint, like someone holding a phone screen low at waist level. I froze. The glow didn't move, didn't brighten. It just sat there between two of the pines, steady and cold-looking. Not white, not blue. Something in between. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a neighbor's porch light filtered through the fog, but there were no houses positioned at that angle. And even if there had been, the glow was too low, too soft, too contained. I squinted to see if someone was standing there. The light didn't cast a silhouette, didn't reveal a shape behind it. It was just there. A few seconds passed. My breath came out in white clouds. Then the glow dimmed. Slowly at first, then abruptly, like someone had covered it with their hand. The darkness that replaced it felt deeper than before. I backed toward the door, not taking my eyes off the trees. The deck boards creaked under my weight, and that small noise broke whatever focus I had. I stepped inside, locked the door, and pulled the curtain tight. The house felt warmer once I was back in, almost too warm. I sat on the couch to calm down, but every shadow in the room felt slightly wrong, like they weren't falling where they normally would. After 5 minutes or so, I convinced myself to check the backyard again, but only through the kitchen window this time. Nothing. The fog had thinned slightly, the trees looked normal, the glow was gone. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing on the other side of the glass facing me. Not tapping, not knocking, just standing there, watching without moving. Around 6 a.m., when the first light started breaking through, I finally drifted off. only for about 20 minutes, but enough that I woke up with that weird shaky feeling you get after a too short nap. When I checked the window again in daylight, the warm patch had gone cold, but there was a faint smear on the outside of the glass, like condensation had formed and then been wiped away. Not a handprint, not a face print, just a blurred streak running horizontally. I went outside and looked at it from the other side. It was faint, but definitely there. The trees were quiet, no glow, no movement. But when I touched the glass again, even from the outside, it felt slightly warmer than the surrounding frame. Just barely, but enough to notice. Enough to remind me that something had been close. Very close. I was driving back from my cousin's place in McCall late on a Sunday night, taking the forest road that cuts between the lake and the ridge. I'd left way later than I meant to, sometime after 11 p.m., and the temperature had dropped enough that a thick fog was hanging low over the road. My headlights were basically pushing through a wall of white. I had the window cracked because the air inside the car felt stale, and every now and then I'd catch the smell of wet pine drifting in. The fog got heavier as I climbed, the kind that moves in slow sheets across the road instead of just sitting still. I kept my speed around 20. I'd taken that road 100 times, but that night I felt weirdly tense, like I was driving somewhere unfamiliar. Even the turns looked sharper, the trees taller. I was rounding a bend when something dark showed through the fog, something above the treetops on my right. I didn't see it all at once. It was more like I caught the absence of light first, a patch where the faint glow of the sky was blocked out. I lifted my foot off the gas. The shape didn't move. It just hovered there, a long, smooth silhouette suspended above the ridgeline. Not a plane, not a helicopter. It didn't blink, didn't shine, didn't pulse. Just a quiet, solid darkness hanging in place. I thought maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by the fog, so I rolled the window down a little farther and leaned to get a better angle. Cold air rushed in, my ears popped slightly. The shape stayed. The fog swirled around it, drifting past as though it wasn't solid at all, but it had edges, clean ones. The bottom looked slightly curved, like the hull of a boat turned upside down. I couldn't see the top. It disappeared into thicker fog. My car slowed almost to a crawl. I didn't remember letting it. I tried to convince myself it was just a cloud formation or a shadow from the ridge. But clouds don't stay that still, and shadows don't hang higher than the trees when there's no moon out. As I approached the next straight stretch of road, the fog ahead thinned suddenly, opening into a clearer pocket. The headlights cut farther. I could see the tops of the pines again. And the shape wasn't there. No movement, no fading, just gone, like someone switching off a slide. The sky behind the trees looked completely normal. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my thumb ached. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see the shape behind me, but I only saw shifting fog and my own red taillights reflected back. I took a few more curves slowly. The fog drifted in and out, thickening, thinning, then thickening again. Every time it cleared, I scanned the sky. Nothing. A few minutes later, I noticed the radio had gone silent. Not static, silent. The display was still on, showing the station number, but the audio had cut out completely. I turned the knob up. Nothing. I switched stations. The numbers changed, but still no sound. That never happens out there. If anything, the radio gets fuzzy near the ridge, but it doesn't just die. My chest felt tight, not in a panic way, more like when you're underwater and your body tells you something isn't right. I rolled the window up, then down again, trying to steady my breathing. The cold air helped, but the pressure didn't go away. A quarter mile later, the fog thinned again, and I saw something pale drift across the road ahead. Just a faint streak, like a beam of light sliding sideways through the trees. It didn't look like a car's headlights. It moved too slow, too smooth, and there was no vehicle around to cast it. The light faded between the trunks and vanished. I slowed even more. My hazard lights were on before I realized I'd hit the button. The road looked empty. The trees were still. Nothing made sense. When I reached the turnout overlook, I pulled in and turned off the engine. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to hear the forest, or maybe I needed to convince myself I wasn't losing it. The fog here was thinner, drifting in soft patches across the ground. I stepped out and listened. At first, everything sounded normal. Wind in the branches, a few insects, my own footsteps on gravel. Then the forest got quiet. Not silent, just muffled, like someone had put a layer of insulation between me and every sound. Even my breathing sounded distant in my ears. I looked toward the trees. A thin veil of fog curled around the pines. And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw a darker shape within the fog. Not as big as the thing I'd seen above the trees earlier, but a smooth curve, almost like the corner of the same object. I blinked. The fog shifted. The shape disappeared. I waited, staring at the same patch of forest until my eyes watered. Nothing changed. When I finally got back in the car, the radio came back on by itself, mid-song, volume low, like nothing had happened. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The dashboard clock, which had been reading 11:42 when I parked, now showed 11:48. I hadn't been outside that long. I drove the rest of the way home barely noticing the road. The fog thinned out a few miles later, and by the time I reached town, the sky was clear enough to see stars. The next morning, everything looked normal. No weird fog, no strange pressure in my chest. The car started fine, radio worked perfectly. But when I checked the paint near the top of the passenger door, don't ask me why, I just felt like I should. I found a single faint streak like something had drawn a finger across the metal. Not a scratch, not dirt, just a clean, dull line cutting through the dew. It wiped away instantly. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the empty driveway, waiting to feel something, fear, relief, anything. What I felt instead was the same strange tightness in my chest I'd felt on the road, like something above me was remembering the sound it made. The power went out a little after 9 p.m., right when I was halfway through reheating leftovers. The microwave clicked off, the lights went dark, and the house fell into that strange, hollow quiet you only get during a blackout. I thought it was just our block at first, but when I stepped outside, the whole neighborhood was dark. Street lamps, porches, even the gas station sign down at the corner. It had been unseasonably warm for March, and the air felt heavy, like it might rain even though the forecast said clear skies. A thin layer of clouds drifted low overhead, just enough to hide the stars. Without the usual glow of the city lights, everything looked washed out and colorless. A couple of my neighbors came out too, Carl from across the street and Mrs. Henson from next door. We exchanged the usual "powers out for you too," and shrugged at each other. It wasn't storming, no wind, no lightning, just an abrupt blackout. I stood on my driveway, mostly because sitting in a dark house sounded miserable. The air smelled like warm asphalt and someone's laundry detergent drifting from an open window. Carl made a joke about calling the power company, then went back inside. Mrs. Henson stayed a minute longer, scanning the sky like she expected something interesting to happen, then sighed and shuffled back indoors. I stayed out, leaning on my car, listening to the quiet. It wasn't total silence. There were still crickets, and somewhere far off a dog barked, but the usual electrical hum was gone. No AC units droning, no streetlight buzz, no faint highway noise, just natural sounds that felt too exposed without the rest. I checked my phone. No service, not even one bar. Wi-Fi was down too, obviously. For some reason, that bothered me more than the blackout. A few minutes passed, maybe 10. Hard to say. I wasn't really paying attention until something changed. The clouds overhead, just one section of them, maybe the size of a football field, started glowing faint blue. Not bright enough to light the ground. More like the inside of the clouds were softly lit from behind, a muted, cold shade of blue that didn't match lightning or reflections or anything I'd seen before. It was too steady. No flicker, no pulse, just a calm, low glow spread across that patch of sky. I stood up straighter. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of transformer explosion lighting the clouds, but there was no sound, no smoke, no flicker, and the glow wasn't positioned anywhere near the power station. It looked higher than that, much higher. I walked into the yard for a better view. The air felt weirdly still, warm but still, like everything was waiting for something. The crickets had stopped. Dogs weren't barking anymore either. The glow shifted slightly, not in brightness, but in shape, stretching along the underside of the clouds like something was drifting inside them. A slow, deliberate movement, not wind. The rest of the clouds weren't moving at the same speed or direction. I narrowed my eyes, trying to see if something solid was behind the light, but the clouds were too thick. Whatever was causing the glow was hidden inside or above them. For a second, I thought I saw a darker shape within the glowing area, something rounded, maybe a curve. It wasn't clear enough to make out, but it felt intentional, like something very large moved beneath the surface of the clouds. I realized then that the neighborhood had gone completely quiet. No insects, no distant cars, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of my own breathing. The blue glow shifted again, this time contracting, pulling inward like a tightening circle. The movement wasn't natural. It was too controlled, too smooth. Clouds don't behave that precisely. I whispered, "What is that?" to no one. Right at that moment, the glow dimmed, slowly at first, then abruptly, as if someone had lowered a switch. The last fragment of blue faded into the darkness, and just as it disappeared completely, the power came back on. Every porch light, street lamp, and living room window flared to life at once. My house lit up behind me. The sudden brightness made the yard feel smaller, almost claustrophobic after all that darkness. I blinked hard, adjusting. The air felt lighter now, the heaviness gone. Crickets started chirping again. A dog barked down the street like it had been interrupted mid-sleep. The clouds looked normal, just gray patches floating across the night sky. I turned around and saw Carl stepping outside again, probably wondering why all the lights came back at once. He didn't mention anything unusual. Didn't say he saw the glow. Judging by the way he glanced around casually, he definitely hadn't. I didn't bring it up. I went inside, locked the door, and stood by the front window, looking out at the spot in the sky where the glow had been. Nothing seemed strange about it now. Just a regular night sky over a regular neighborhood. But when I checked my phone, the time caught me off guard. It was 9:43 p.m. I could have sworn only 10 or 15 minutes had passed since the blackout started, but the timestamp on my text messages said I'd lost almost half an hour. I didn't remember standing outside that long. I chalked it up to losing track of time, until I walked back into the kitchen and saw the microwave display blinking 12. That wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was the faint blue reflection on the stainless steel door, just a smear of pale color that vanished as soon as I stepped between it and the window. I was sitting on the back deck after dinner, letting the dog wander around the yard while the last bit of daylight faded. It had been one of those warm but not hot evenings in late July, the kind where the air feels heavy but comfortable. A thin layer of clouds stretched across the sky, moving slow enough that you could almost forget they were moving at all. I wasn't doing anything special, just scrolling my phone, half reading messages, half listening to the dog sniff every corner of the fence. The cicadas were loud, but steady. It felt like any other summer night. Then my ears popped. Not a soft little pop like you get in an elevator, a real pressure shift, sharp, sudden, enough that I flinched and sat up straighter. It felt like the air around me compressed for half a second, like someone had opened or closed a giant, invisible door nearby. The cicadas cut out at the exact same moment. I looked up immediately. The sky didn't look any different at first. Just those thin clouds gliding across, catching the last bits of twilight. But the silence hit harder than the pressure change. My yard isn't far from the interstate, and there's usually a faint rumble of distant traffic. There was nothing now. No insects. No cars. No wind. My dog, Milo, had stopped moving. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing in the grass with his tail lowered, ears forward. I followed his gaze upward. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, through a thinner patch of cloud, I caught a single point of light drifting. Not shooting, not blinking, not streaking across the sky like a plane. Drifting. Slowly, smoothly. It wasn't bright. If anything, it looked too dim, like the glow from a phone screen viewed from far away, but it was definitely there, a pale spot moving between the layers of cloud. I stood without thinking, like stepping to the edge of the deck to get a clearer angle. My ears still felt plugged, like after swimming. I swallowed a few times, but it didn't fix it. The light kept drifting. It didn't match any aircraft pattern I'd ever seen. No blinking, no red or green markers, no contrail. It didn't even seem to be piercing the cloud. It was inside it or behind it, but close enough that the clouds glowed faintly around it. Then it slowed, just a little. enough that I could tell because the cloud layer behind it kept moving while the light almost paused. Milo growled softly, not barking, just that low, confused sound dogs make when something is outside their understanding. I took another step into the yard. The air felt wrong. Not colder or warmer, just thick, like breathing through fabric. I kept looking up. The light hung there motionless now, perfectly still in a patch of thinning cloud. The cloud drifted away, leaving the light exposed for maybe 2 seconds. It wasn't a light anymore. It was a small, round shape, dark, almost silhouette-like, with a thin rim of pale illumination around it. Not glowing exactly, but highlighted by something. Size was hard to judge, but it looked bigger than a drone, smaller than a plane, somewhere between. Then the cloud covered it again, and when it emerged on the other side, it was just a dim point of light once more. The pressure in my ears shifted again, this time softer, like a slow exhale from the sky. Milo whined and backed up until he was pressed against my leg. I put a hand on his back without taking my eyes off the drifting point. It began moving again, but now in a perfectly straight line toward the thicker cloud bank near the horizon. No bobbing, no rise or fall, just a steady, almost mechanical glide. Before it reached the clouds, it dimmed, not like a light turning off, more like it was being absorbed into the darkness. Each second it grew fainter, until the only sign left was the way the clouds briefly brightened around where it should have been. Then it was gone, just gone. The silence held for several more seconds. The air still felt heavy, my ears still felt clogged. Milo didn't move. Then, as abruptly as the pressure had come, everything snapped back. The cicadas roared to life again. A car passed on the main road, its sound rolling through the trees like normal. A breeze slipped across the yard and sent a few dried leaves skittering across the deck. My ears popped once more, finally clearing. Milo shook himself and trotted toward the house like nothing had happened. I stood in the grass for another minute or two, staring at the sky. The clouds looked ordinary now. Just gray, dull shapes drifting lazily overhead. Nothing moved behind them. Nothing glowed. I checked my phone out of instinct. The time had jumped. I had gone outside a little after 8:20. The last text I'd read was time-stamped 8:23. When I looked again, the screen said 8:37. I didn't think I'd been watching the sky for 14 minutes. Not even close. It felt like a minute or two at most. I walked around the yard to see if maybe something else had changed, but everything looked normal. The fence, the flower beds, the patio table. No scorch marks or broken branches or anything dramatic like that. Before going inside, I looked up again. The clouds were evenly lit by the fading day. The sky looked calm, peaceful. But as I turned to open the sliding door, the dog growled once more, one quick, uneasy rumble. I followed his gaze. He wasn't looking at the sky this time. He was looking just above the roofline of the house, a place I hadn't checked at all. I squinted, trying to see what he saw, but there was nothing, just a pale stretch of cloud behind the chimney. The air felt thick again for only a moment. Then, normal. I went inside and locked the door out of habit, even though nothing had really happened. Or maybe because something had. I kept glancing out the window for the rest of the night, waiting for another dim point of light to drift into view. None did. But every so often, for no clear reason, my ears would pop again. Just lightly, like something above the clouds was shifting. I was driving back from a work trip in eastern Colorado, taking one of those long, empty stretches of highway where the radio barely comes in and the mile markers feel like they're spaced too far apart. It was close to 10 p.m., already fully dark, and the only reason I didn't stop for the night was because I'd promised my coworker Paul I'd drop off some equipment in Fort Morgan before morning. The air was clear, no wind, visibility perfect. One of those crisp early autumn nights where the sky feels bigger than usual. For a while, the drive was actually relaxing. Hardly any traffic, just the occasional semi on the opposite side. My headlights pushed out onto the asphalt, and every now and then the reflective paint on the road signs would flash back at me. I wasn't tired, but I wasn't exactly alert either. More like drifting through the motions of an easy drive. I had just passed a cluster of grain silos when something overhead caught my eye. Not movement, not light, just a flash of brightness in the corner of the windshield, like my headlights had bounced off something above me. At first, I thought it was my own imagination, maybe a reflection from the dashboard, but then it happened again, clearer this time. A tiny, sharp glint directly above the road. Exactly the kind of reflection you get when light hits metal, except there was nothing that should have reflected anything. No planes, no low-flying drones, no towers, just open sky. I slowed down a little and leaned forward, looking through the windshield at a steeper angle. The glint came a third time, slightly longer, and that's when I saw it. A metallic surface, smooth, curved, and catching my headlights from below. It was high enough that the reflection was faint, but low enough that it definitely wasn't a star or a plane. And it wasn't moving like one either. It hung in place, maybe 100 feet above the highway, just far enough into the darkness that I couldn't see its full shape. I turned off the high beams for a second, trying to see if the reflection changed. It didn't. The metallic thing stayed exactly where it was, absolutely still. I don't know why, but I tapped the brakes and rolled to a slower speed. Maybe instinct. Maybe caution. The moment my speed dropped, the object tilted just slightly, like it was rotating around a central point. No sound, no engine noise, no wind displacement. The tilt revealed a bit more of its shape, a rounded underside like the bottom of a thick disc or a huge flattened teardrop. No lights on it, no windows, nothing identifiable, just smooth metal catching stray beams of my headlights. I whispered, "What the hell?" without meaning to. The road around me was dead quiet. No other cars, no nearby towns, just the hum of my engine and my tires on the pavement. My pulse started picking up, that deep instinctive panic you feel when something is wrong and you can't figure out why. Then the object tilted again, this time more sharply, and before I could react, it moved, not sideways, not forward, straight up. It didn't accelerate, it didn't stretch or flare or rocket away. It just slipped upward, like gravity had reversed for it, and it was casually drifting away. One moment it was there, catching the last of my headlights, and the next moment it was swallowed by the darkness above. I craned my neck out the window to follow it, but the sky was empty. Stars in every direction, nothing blocking them. My heart was pounding now. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and put the car in park, keeping the engine running. I stepped out and stood on the edge of the highway. The cold air hit me hard after the warmth inside the car. I looked straight up again. Nothing. No stars blinking out. No clouds, no glint, just a quiet sky. I stayed there for maybe a minute before climbing back into the car. I shut the door and pulled onto the road, shaky but trying to keep it together. As I merged back onto the highway, my dashboard clock caught my attention. 10:04 p.m. It had been 10:01 when I first saw the glint. What had felt like maybe 30 seconds had apparently been 3 minutes. I told myself it was possible I had pulled over, gotten out, stood there, but it didn't feel like 3 minutes. Not even close. About 5 miles later, my radio crackled with static. Not normal static, more like bursts of clipped noise, as if something was interrupting the signal in uneven chunks. I turned the volume down, but the static didn't stop. It just kept stuttering in the background, a broken mechanical rhythm. I switched stations, all static. AM, FM, same thing. Even when I turned the radio off completely, I could still hear faint popping noises from the speakers, like they were picking up interference from something nearby. The highway stayed empty ahead of me. I drove faster than I should have after that, even though my hands were trembling enough that I could feel the shudder in the wheel. Every reflective road sign made me jump. Every shadow felt too sharp. I kept scanning the sky, half convinced I'd see the object again hovering above me, but the sky stayed clear. When I finally reached Fort Morgan, the radio cut back in, mid-song, volume exactly where I'd left it before turning it off. No static, no popping, no trace of anything wrong. I sat in the parking lot outside Paul's shop for a full minute before shutting off the engine. My headlights cast 2 perfect cones of light onto the garage door, and for just a second I thought I saw a faint metallic shimmer on the surface of the door. Not a reflection of my headlights, something else, something shaped. When I blinked, it was gone. Inside, everything felt normal. Paul joked about me being late. We unloaded the equipment, and he didn't seem to notice anything strange about me. I didn't mention the drive. I didn't want to hear myself say the words out loud. But the weirdest part happened later when I got home. I walked around to the front of my car to grab my bag from the passenger seat, and I noticed the hood felt warm. Warmer than it should have been after a 2-hour drive in cool night air. Not engine warm, not sun warm. Warm across the top surface like something had been hovering just above it earlier, radiating heat downward. My hand stayed on the metal a few seconds longer than it should have, long enough to know I wasn't imagining it. I noticed the compass acting strange before anything else happened. I wasn't even using it for navigation at that point. I knew the trail well enough. It was just habit to check it every now and then. I'd taken the North Ridge Trail above Silverton, the one that cuts between two big rock outcrops before climbing toward the overlook. Late afternoon, early fall, cool enough that my breath showed a little when the wind hit just right. I'd been hiking alone most of the day. Saw a couple trail runners earlier, a family with kids at the lower lake, but by the time I reached the ridge, I hadn't heard another human voice in at least an hour. Just wind, distant water, the scrape of fine gravel under my boots. When I pulled the compass from my jacket pocket, the needle was drifting. Not snapping back and forth like when you're near metal, just drifting in a slow, lazy circle, almost like it was floating instead of pivoting. I tapped the glass once. It kept spinning, a full rotation every 5 or 6 seconds. Too slow for anything normal. I stopped walking and held it out in front of me, away from my pack, away from anything it could pick up. The needle slowed and then locked, not pointing north, not pointing toward anything obvious, just fixed in one direction straight toward the ridge ahead. I frowned and turned my body slightly. The needle didn't move. I turned all the way around. The needle still pointed toward the ridge like something was pulling it. The air felt colder suddenly. The wind was still, though. No movement in the trees below, no sound except my own breathing. I glanced up toward where the ridge rose above me. It was steep, but not dramatic, just a long, sloping line of gray rock and scattered pines. Nothing unusual. I took a few steps forward. The compass needle twitched, then steadied again, still pointing the same way. I don't know why I kept walking. Maybe curiosity beat out discomfort. Maybe I wanted a better vantage point to figure out what was messing with the compass. The trail climbed gradually, and the stretch ahead led to a small clearing where the view opened up. As I approached that clearing, the air pressure seemed to shift. Not a pop, not a wind gust, just a subtle weight, like stepping into a slightly different atmosphere. I paused and looked around. Everything was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Even at higher elevation, I should have heard something. Distant birds, insects, wind in the branches. But there was nothing. My footsteps felt too loud when I moved again. I reached the clearing and scanned the ridge above. That's when I saw the glow. It wasn't bright at first, just a faint, pale shimmer right above the crest, like someone shining a flashlight through fog from the other side. Except there was no fog, and the light wasn't spreading or diffusing. It was concentrated in a soft, circular patch maybe 20 feet across. I stood there holding my breath without meaning to. Then the glow pulsed, once. Not like lightning. Not like anything electrical. It was slow, controlled, almost like a heartbeat, if a heartbeat could light up the sky for half a second. The pulse brightened just enough to outline the shape of a few scrub pines at the top of the ridge. Then it faded completely. The silence pressed in harder. I looked at the compass. The needle was still frozen in that same direction, pointing directly at the spot where the glow had been. I waited, staring at the ridge, expecting another pulse or movement or something, but the sky above it stayed blank and pale. The kind of nothingness you get before dusk when light doesn't know what to do yet. I should have turned back, everything in me said to, but I took a few steps uphill anyway, slow and cautious. The air felt heavier with each step, though nothing around me moved. The trees looked normal. The rocks looked normal. My footsteps didn't echo, but they felt wrong, like the sound was being swallowed before it could travel. Halfway up the slope, the compass needle began to move again. Not spin, slide. Smoothly. It shifted 1 degree at a time like it was being reoriented to something overhead. I looked up quickly. Nothing. Just sky. Then the needle snapped to a new position. Straight up. Straight. Up. I felt my stomach tighten. I held the compass over my head, turning in place, but the needle didn't budge. It pointed at the sky no matter where I moved. The ridge above me suddenly felt too exposed, like I was standing in the open instead of among trees and rocks. The air temperature dropped sharply. I watched my breath leave my mouth in a thin cloud. And then I heard something. A soft vibration, not sound exactly, but a feeling. A low hum that seemed to pass through my chest rather than through my ears. It was faint, steady, as if coming from far away or muffled by something I couldn't see. I stepped backward. The hum didn't grow louder or quieter. It didn't change at all. But the compass needle trembled once, then twitched back toward the ridge, the same angle as before. I didn't want to be there anymore. I started down the slope, not running, but close to it. The pressure in the air eased with each step. When I reached the clearing again, the cicadas started, abruptly, like someone had unmuted the world. Wind moved through the pines. A bird called somewhere far off. Everything returned at once. I looked back up at the ridge. No glow, no shimmer, no sign anything had happened. The compass needle finally swung back to north. On the way down the main trail, a few things kept nagging at me. The smell in the air had changed. Faint metallic tang, like the scent before a summer storm, except the sky was clear. My watch said it was 5:42 p.m., but it had been just after 5:10 when I checked it at the lower switchback. I didn't think I'd spent 30 minutes on that ridge. Maybe 10, 15. Back at the trailhead, a couple was unloading their gear. I must have looked shaken because the woman asked if I was okay. I told her, yeah, just sore from the climb. She laughed politely. But when I got into my car and checked my phone, the weirdest part hit. The compass app, one I barely used, opened by itself. No notifications, no accidental touches. It was just open. The digital needle spinning wildly before locking in place, not pointing north, pointing up. I closed the app. The needle stayed frozen for a couple seconds before the phone finally recalibrated and snapped back to normal orientation. On the drive home, every time I passed a ridge or hill, I found myself checking the sky. Not looking for a glow exactly, just looking for anything that didn't belong. Nothing showed. But hours later, when I was lying in bed trying to sleep, I felt the same pressure shift in my ears. Soft, subtle, like something moving far above the house. I didn't check the window, I just listened. And for a few seconds, the world went completely still again. I had been driving most of the afternoon and stopped at the overlook mainly to give my eyes a break. It was one of those pull-offs along Highway 550 heading toward Durango, where the mountains drop off hard and you can see for miles. Early evening, right before dusk. The sky was still light, but the sun had already slipped behind one of the bigger peaks. There wasn't anyone else there. No motorcycles, no RVs, no couples taking photos. Just me, my old Subaru, and a stretch of guardrail that didn't look like it would actually stop anything from going over if it came to that. I turned off the engine but stayed inside the car, leaning back and stretching. The air was cooler than it had been in town and the windows fogged a little from my breath. I remember thinking about getting out, maybe walking to the edge, but I felt strangely tired, heavier than I should have been after just a couple hours of driving. Then the car rocked, just once. A short, gentle nudge, like someone had pushed the bumper with one hand. Not enough to scare me, but enough that I sat up quickly. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer brushing against the side, but I didn't see any movement, nothing in the mirrors, nothing in front of the hood. I opened the door and stepped out slowly. The air was colder outside, not wind chill cold, just colder than it should have been. I walked around the car, expecting to see maybe a fresh scratch or dirt smear, but there was nothing. I crouched and checked under the chassis, but the gravel was undisturbed. Behind me, the mountains stretched out in layers, fading from dark green to blue to almost gray as they hit the horizon. I stood there breathing the thin air, trying to figure out what could have moved the car like that. Then I saw the light. At first, I assumed it was headlights from another car coming around the bend below, but there was no road in that direction, just miles of jagged ridges and valleys. The pale light slid along the distant horizon in a straight horizontal line. It didn't flicker, it didn't brighten or dim. It just glided smoothly, like someone dragging a flashlight behind a ridge. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate anything around it, but it was visible even in the remaining daylight. A faded white, almost bluish. I walked closer to the guardrail and leaned forward to see better. The light didn't speed up or slow down. It didn't change direction. It just kept gliding for maybe 6 or 7 seconds. Then, without fading, it vanished. Not dipped behind a ridge, not obscured by a cloud. It blinked out midair like someone had flipped a switch. I stayed where I was, listening. The wind had stopped, completely. The trees down the slope weren't moving, and the usual faint hum of distant traffic was gone. I didn't realize how quiet it had become until I heard myself swallow. After a minute, I went back to the car. I kept expecting another gust of wind, another tremble beneath the tires, something. But the air stayed still. Even the gravel didn't crunch right under my shoes. The footsteps sounded flat, like the sound wasn't carrying. Inside the car, the interior felt warmer. I don't know why that made me more uneasy, but it did. I grabbed my phone off the passenger seat out of instinct. No service, which wasn't unusual out there. But the battery indicator had dropped from around 60% to 38% since I'd checked it maybe 20 minutes earlier. I locked the phone and tried to shake off the feeling crawling up my spine. Before I started the engine, I looked back at the horizon. Something shimmered. Not the same pale light, more like heat distortion, even though the air was cold. A thin ripple passed across the sky above the ridge where the light had disappeared. It lasted only a second or two before dissolving. My first thought was that it might have been a plane catching sunlight at a strange angle, but there wasn't any sun left to reflect. The sky in that direction was an even, soft blue fading toward gray. When I turned the key, the engine hesitated. Just a half-second delay before catching, but I noticed. My car never hesitated. I checked the dashboard out of habit. The clock was 2 minutes ahead of what I remembered. I don't know why that bothered me. 2 minutes wasn't much, but something felt off. As I put the car in drive, the tires rolled over the gravel normally again. The engine sounded normal. Everything suddenly felt normal, except me. I didn't want to stay at the overlook anymore. I pulled back onto the highway and kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see another flicker of light behind me or a shimmer over the ridge. Nothing followed. But about 5 miles down, something strange happened again. My ears popped. Not from elevation. I'd been both higher and lower already that day without any issue. This was the same kind of pressure drop you feel before a storm, except the sky had cleared and the air was still. It passed quickly, but the silence afterward felt different. Not gone sound different. More like the world had gone slightly out of sync for a moment. I kept driving. At the next turnout, just a small dirt pull-off where people parked to go rock climbing, I stopped again, mostly to convince myself everything was fine. I stepped out and listened. Wind, birds, the distant sound of a truck grinding its way uphill. Everything normal. But when I looked back in the direction of the overlook, the horizon looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just slightly brighter in one thin line, fading upward into the darker sky. Like the color had been stretched. I blinked and it looked normal again. I didn't wait around for anything else. I got back in the car and drove straight to town. Windows cracked just enough to feel the real wind. Something grounded. Something I understood. Hours later, when I unpacked my bag at the motel, I found the compass I kept clipped to the side pocket. I hadn't touched it that day. It should have been pointing north. It wasn't. The needle was fixed at a diagonal angle, locked in place like the magnetic disc had been glued down. I tapped the plastic. It didn't budge. When I looked again 10 minutes later, the needle was pointing north like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time a car passed outside, I caught myself glancing at the curtains, half expecting a pale light to slide silently along the sky again. It didn't. But the next morning when I went out to the parking lot, my car felt cold, colder than the air, like something had pressed against it during the night, like that single gentle rock at the overlook hadn't been random. I was walking home from my friend Jared's place after we wrapped up a late board game night. It was close to midnight, cool enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. The neighborhood was quiet, one of those older residential areas outside Flagstaff, where the streetlights are spaced far apart and the houses sit back behind big pines. I usually cut down Brookside Lane because it saves a few minutes, even though it doesn't have sidewalks and the lights flicker sometimes. I'd walked it dozens of times. I never thought twice about it. That night, though, something felt off as soon as I turned onto it. The air felt a little thicker, like the pressure had dropped. Nothing dramatic, just enough for me to notice. I chalked it up to being tired. I kept walking. A motion sensor light flicked on at the Reynolds place, spilling yellowish light across their driveway and the edge of the road. I stepped into it and saw my shadow stretch out long behind me, which was normal. Those lights always distort shadows. But then it kept stretching, longer than it should have. Way longer. It stretched almost all the way across the Reynolds yard, thinning out until it barely had a shape. I stopped walking, but the shadow didn't stop. It kept pulling, the way a rubber band stretches before snapping. My heart kicked once, hard. Then suddenly, it snapped back. Not gradually, instantly. My shadow returned to its normal length like it had never moved. The motion light clicked off a second later, leaving me in the dark. I stood there listening, trying to hear anything. Wind, a dog, a car. There was nothing. Even the distant hum from the highway was gone. Just silence, thick enough that it felt like something was absorbing the sound. I told myself it was just the weird angle of the light. Maybe fog I hadn't noticed, yet the air was clear. I kept walking, maybe a bit faster than before. About halfway down the street, I passed under one of the spaced-out street lamps. The bulb above me buzzed faintly, and for a moment the light flickered. When it steadied again, the shadow it cast looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stayed up. I looked up at the sky without thinking. At first, it looked like a regular clear night, a few stars peeking between the branches. But then I noticed a faint haze, just a thin wash of pale light, moving behind the treetops. Not fast, not bright, just drifting like a soft glow pushed by a slow breeze, except there was no breeze. The pines weren't moving at all. The glow wasn't moonlight. The moon was behind me, low and blocked by houses. This was something else, too diffuse to be a flashlight, too consistent to be a plane. I kept staring at it, trying to figure out if it was even above the trees or behind them. It was hard to tell. The glow pulsed once, faint like a breath, and then steadied. I held still, half crouched without realizing it. Then the glow moved. Not down, not up, just sideways. Smooth and straight, not following the tree line or drifting like a cloud. It slid across a small patch of sky, paused, slid again, then faded until I couldn't tell if it was gone or just perfectly still. My first instinct was to get home, not run, but keep moving. I kept my head down for a minute or two, focusing on the cracks in the pavement, the rhythm of my steps. The silence shifted a little. Still quiet, but now I heard a low hum somewhere far off. Not mechanical, more like the sound power lines make, but deeper and irregular. It wasn't coming from the lines above me. I checked. The hum grew stronger for a moment and then cut out instantly, leaving the air feeling hollow. When I turned the corner onto my street, everything looked normal. Porch lights, a TV flickering behind the Harrisons' curtains, someone's wind chimes moving slightly, even though the air was still. I glanced back toward Brookside Lane. That faint glow was visible again, but smaller now, farther away. It hovered above the last street lamp, dim enough that someone not looking for it might have missed it. It pulsed once again. A soft pulse, more like an echo than a signal. My shadow stretched again. Not much, just a quick tug, like something pulling at its edges for a fraction of a second, then normal. I walked faster. As I reached my driveway, the porch light flicked on, and everything looked completely ordinary. My house, my car, the same potted plant I kept forgetting to water. I stood there a moment, breathing hard, even though I hadn't run. The glow faded behind the trees. I unlocked the door and stepped into the house. The normal sounds returned. Fridge humming, heater kicking on, a car driving down the main road a couple blocks over. It felt grounding. Before going to bed, I checked outside again through the blinds. No glow, no strange shadows, just a dark residential street. But when I turned away from the window, something about the room felt slightly wrong. Not bad, just off. A pressure in the air, the faintest hint of static on my skin. I tried to ignore it. As I lay in bed, I could picture that one moment over and over, my shadow stretching across the Reynolds yard like it wasn't connected to me anymore. Right before I finally drifted off, the house made a small sound, just a soft vibration in the floorboards like something passing by outside. I didn't get up to look, but I listened. and for a few seconds, the world was completely silent again. I was driving back from my sister's place in Rio Vista, taking the long rural road that cuts through empty fields before reconnecting with the highway. It was close to 11 p.m., one of those cloudless, crisp nights where the air feels thinner than usual and the stars look sharper. I wasn't tired, just ready to be home. The road was straight, flat, and completely empty. No headlights behind me, nothing coming toward me. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock. 10:54. A few minutes later, the sky ahead did something I still don't have a good word for. I first noticed it as a faint shimmer, like heat distortion. But it made no sense because the air was cold and the stars were bright. The shimmer stretched across a wide band of the sky, directly above the road, and it wasn't subtle. It looked like someone had pressed their hand gently into the night, causing a ripple pattern to move through the stars. Not a cloud, not fog, not a reflection. The stars themselves seemed to shift just slightly, bending or warping as the ripple passed through them. I slowed down without thinking. The ripple rolled across the sky from left to right, moving steadily, silently. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't drifting either. Just a smooth wave like a sheet being lifted by invisible wind. Then everything froze. The stars went perfectly still again, too still, in a way. The sky looked almost painted on, flat and flawless, like nothing had moved at all. I sat there in the middle of the road, foot on the brake, engine idling. The air inside the car felt heavy, like the pressure had changed. My ears buzzed faintly. I took my foot off the brake and coasted forward, trying to convince myself the whole thing was some kind of atmospheric illusion. But my chest felt tight, and the hair on my arms was standing on end. I drove another quarter-mile before I noticed the next strange thing. My dashboard clock now read 11:05. I stared at it long enough that I drifted slightly toward the shoulder and had to correct. I grabbed my phone to check the time there, 10:59. The car clock was 6 minutes ahead. It had jumped, and I hadn't touched it. My car isn't fancy. The clock doesn't auto-sync. You have to adjust it manually, and I definitely hadn't done that while staring at the sky. I kept driving, slower now. The stars remained normal. No more ripples, no distortions. But the air still felt wrong. Every sound in the cabin, engine hum, tires on asphalt, seemed muted in a way I can't explain. The silence outside the car felt thick, like something was pressing in on the world. About 10 minutes later, I passed a small turnout with a single street lamp. The light flickered as I drove by, even though there was no wind or interference. It flickered again after I passed, this time longer, dimming until it barely glowed. The moment it went dim, the pressure in my ears changed again. A soft pop, like I'd gone up a steep hill, except the road was flat. I pulled over. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted the sky to look normal. Maybe I needed air. I turned the engine off and stepped outside, leaving the door open behind me. The silence was unreal. No insects, no distant traffic from the highway miles away, no wind through the dry grass. Just a deep, unmoving quiet. My phone showed full signal, which somehow felt stranger than if it had shown nothing at all. I looked up at the sky. Everything was still normal. Stars where they should be. Constellations sharp, no ripples. But directly above me, almost centered over the car, the stars seemed slightly dimmer. Not blocked, just softened, as if a faint haze lay across a circular patch of the sky. I rubbed my eyes, stepped backward, looked again. The dim patch remained. A perfectly round area, maybe the size of a full moon, but much fainter, where the stars shimmered just a fraction less than the rest of the sky. It wasn't bright, it wasn't dark, it was just subtly wrong. Then the dim patch began to move. Not drift, move, straight upward, slowly, impossibly smooth. As it rose, the stars behind it brightened again, and the area above it dimmed like something nearly invisible was lifting through layers of sky. I held my breath. The shape, or whatever it was, continued rising until it blended perfectly with the stars and vanished entirely. The moment it disappeared, the street lamp behind me snapped back to full brightness. Crickets started chirping. A breeze moved through the grass. Everything resumed like someone had released a pause button. I got back into the car, shut the door, locked it out of instinct. My hands were shaking. The dashboard clock still read 11:05. My phone read 10:59. I drove home without stopping again, checking the mirrors every few seconds, even though I had no idea what I expected to see. Nothing followed me, nothing appeared in the sky, but the feeling stayed with me. The sense that something enormous and silent had moved through the air above without wanting to be noticed. When I pulled into my driveway, the car clock finally synced to the time on my phone, but not gradually. It jumped backward in two quick flickers until it matched exactly. I didn't touch any buttons. I sat there in the parked car for a long time, watching the sky over the roof of the house, waiting for another ripple or distortion. The stars remained steady, but every now and then, for just a split second, the air around me felt denser, like something large and quiet was passing by high above, too far to see, but close enough to affect the world in small, impossible ways. And each time it happened, I found myself checking the clock again. I was up earlier than usual that morning, mostly because I hadn't slept well. It was late March, and the house had felt colder than normal overnight. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something, soft footsteps outside or maybe the heater turning on, but every time I got up to check, nothing was there. By around 5 a.m., I gave up on sleep altogether and went to make coffee. My place sits on the edge of a small town in eastern Washington. Not farmland exactly, but open enough that you can see the horizon clearly if you look past the line of scrub trees behind the yard. Most mornings, I'd sit at the kitchen table, scroll my phone, wait for the sun to rise. That morning, something felt off before I even looked outside. The air had a strange stillness to it. No wind, no birds, not even the usual hum from the neighbor's heating unit. I noticed it only because silence at that hour isn't normal. There's always something, even faint. I walked to the sliding glass door with my mug of coffee and looked out. At first I thought the sun was rising early, but the light wasn't right. Instead of spreading across the sky or softening into the clouds, there was a single narrow column of brightness on the horizon. Not wide, maybe the width of a house from my perspective. A vertical strip of daylight. Everything around it was still dim, bluish, exactly what you'd expect before dawn. But this one section looked almost like someone had cut a slice out of the horizon and turned on a spotlight behind it. I set the mug down and leaned closer to the glass. The strip didn't flicker or shift. It just glowed, straight up and down. My first thought was some weird atmospheric effect, maybe light reflecting off moisture or a plane contrail catching the early sun. But it wasn't spreading outward at all. The light didn't behave like sunlight. No gradients, no soft edges. It looked self-contained. I slid the door open and stepped outside. The cold hit immediately, sharp enough that I could feel it through my socks. But what really bothered me was the pressure. It felt like the air thickened the moment I crossed the threshold. My ears didn't pop, but they felt tight. The vertical glow remained exactly where it had been. No sound came from the trees, not even creaking. I walked to the middle of the yard, stopping where the ground dipped slightly. From there, I had a better angle. The strip of light extended upward farther than I'd realized, straight into the clouds. Except the clouds above it weren't reacting. They didn't brighten. They didn't glow. They just sat there, heavy and gray, with this one bright column rising into them. I checked my phone out of instinct. The screen said 5:22 a.m. Sunrise was supposed to be closer to 6:40 that day. The column pulsed. Not outward, upward. The brightness surged for a moment, then retracted a few inches like whatever caused it had moved. The whole strip seemed to climb, lifting up toward the cloud layer in a smooth motion, maybe an inch or two per second. That was the first moment real fear hit me. Not panic, just a sudden awareness that something was happening that I couldn't classify. I stood perfectly still. The light continued retracting upward. Slowly at first, then faster. It wasn't fading, it was rising. The bottom edge lifted cleanly off the horizon like it had never been attached to it. Once the glow was maybe 20 feet above the tree line, the column narrowed, the top collapsing into a single bright point. Then the point lifted. It rose straight up into the clouds without bending, without dimming, without leaving any glow behind. Once it reached the cloud layer, the light diffused slightly, illuminating the underside of the clouds for a heartbeat, just a soft, pale bloom. Then nothing. The sky went back to its normal early morning gray. The horizon stayed dark. The clouds absorbed whatever brightness had been there. The silence hung for several more seconds. Then the wind returned, Just a small gust, but enough to rattle the branches. A bird chirped once. The heater next door hummed on. Everything in the world seemed to resume at the same instant, like someone had pressed play again. I realized I was shivering uncontrollably. I hadn't noticed the cold while the light was there. Now it felt like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. I went back inside and closed the sliding door, forcing it shut harder than I meant to. My hands were trembling. I checked the time again. 5:24 a.m. 2 minutes had passed, but it felt shorter. I tried to convince myself it could have been some strange aircraft phenomenon, maybe something reflecting off low clouds, but the light had been too perfectly vertical, too sharp, too contained. I made myself sit down at the table and sip the now lukewarm coffee. My breath fogged slightly in the kitchen, which didn't make sense because the thermostat said the house was still warm. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway. Around 6:15, when the real sunrise started to brighten the sky, I went back outside to check the horizon again. The trees looked normal, no glow, no marks. But there was a faint smell in the air, something metallic, like the smell that lingers after welding or after lightning strikes something nearby. I stood there listening. Everything sounded normal again. I didn't mention any of this to anyone that day, or the next. But for the next few mornings, I woke up before dawn without setting an alarm, like my body expected something else to happen. I'd check the horizon through the blinds, heart beating too fast every time I saw even a hint of light. Nothing unusual happened again, except the silence. Every so often, usually before sunrise, the world would go still for a few seconds, not long enough to call it anything. Just long enough to remind me of that morning when the sky tried to brighten in a way it shouldn't have, and then pulled the light back into the clouds, like it hadn't meant to reveal anything at all. I heard about it from my neighbor before I knew anything had happened. I was taking the trash bins to the curb when Mrs. Klein from across the street waved me over. She's in her 70s, usually soft-spoken, but that morning she looked genuinely unsettled. She asked if everything was all right at my place. I thought she meant the noise I'd dragging the bins, so I apologized. "No," she said. "I meant last night, around 2. I saw something over your house." I blinked at her, unsure how to respond. I asked what she meant, and she hesitated like she was trying to decide if she should keep talking. Then she said she'd seen lights, white, almost bluish, hovering above my roofline for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, not moving the way a plane or drone would, just sitting there. When she realized I had no idea what she was talking about, she apologized and backed off like she'd intruded. But I kept thinking about it as I finished taking the bins out. I hadn't heard anything during the night. I'd gone to bed around 11, slept straight through. As soon as I got back inside, I pulled up my security camera app. The front porch cam was normal, the driveway cam was normal. Then I opened the backyard feed. At 2 or 3 a.m., the footage flickered. Not a simple glitch, an actual bright flash that washed out the entire frame for a second. After the flash, the image became scrambled, like static or corrupted pixels, and the timestamp jumped forward. The feed went from 2:3:11 directly to 2:3:19, 8 seconds gone. When the video stabilized again, everything looked normal. Dark yard, faint glow of the neighbor's porch light, motions still detected by the wind in the trees. No sign of anything unusual, but 8 seconds were just missing. I replayed it several times, trying to see if any shape or shadow appeared right before the flash. There was nothing, just the usual grainy night footage. The weird part was that the glitch didn't happen on any of the other cameras. Only the backyard one, the one facing the side of the house closest to my bedroom window. I stood there, staring at the footage longer than necessary. My hands felt cold even though the house was warm. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Klein had said, hovering, lights not moving, and the fact that I had slept through all of it. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe the camera had just malfunctioned. Maybe she'd seen a helicopter far away and misjudged the distance. I tried to leave it at that. Later that afternoon, I went outside to check the yard. Nothing was disturbed. No branches down, no marks on the grass, no sign anyone had been there. But when I looked up at the section of roof above my bedroom, I noticed a faint discoloration on the shingles. Not a burn, not soot. more like a chalky gray patch, maybe 3 feet across. It could have been there for months. I don't usually stare at my roof, but it looked out of place once I noticed it. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I kept glancing out the windows like I expected something to happen again. Midnight passed quietly. Around 1, I turned off the TV and sat on the couch in the dark, listening. The house felt unusually still. Not silent exactly, but muffled. The fridge hum sounded distant. The occasional car passing on the main road didn't carry the way it usually did. The air had a strange heaviness to it, like a storm was coming, except the sky had been clear when I'd last checked. At 1:47 a.m., the backyard motion alert popped up on my phone. I froze for a second before opening the live feed. The yard was dark, still. No animal, no intruder, no branches moving. Just darkness and the faint halo from the neighbor's light. The motion detection box flickered on random patches like the camera couldn't decide where the movement was. I stepped quietly to the back door and looked through the glass. Nothing, but the air felt different again. Denser, like pressure shifting before a plane passes overhead. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The moment I did, a faint flash lit the yard, not bright, not like lightning, just a soft pulse that seemed to come from above, though I couldn't see the source. The light didn't illuminate anything. It was more like the darkness thinned for half a second. The camera feed on my phone froze. I stepped outside, slow and careful. The grass was cold enough to feel through my socks. I tilted my head back, searching the sky. It was clear, moonless, full of stars. Then some small, dim shape shifted across a patch of stars near the roofline, not blocking them completely, just distorting them like looking through warped glass. It moved too smoothly to be a bird, too slow to be a plane. A faint shimmer outlined its edge for a moment, then faded. I held my breath without meaning to. The shape drifted a few feet to the side, almost silent except for a soft vibration I felt more than heard. It didn't glow, it didn't pulse. It just existed there, slightly darker than the sky behind it. Then the distortion tightened, shrinking into a point before vanishing completely. No streak, no trail, just gone. A second later, the normal night sounds returned all at once. A distant dog barking, wind brushing the leaves, a car engine faint in the distance. My backyard camera unfroze and resumed recording like nothing had happened. I backed inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay on the couch with the lights off, watching the glow from the street lamps shift across the ceiling. Every time the house made a noise, pipes settling, wood creaking, I felt my pulse jump. In the morning, I checked the footage again. The same 8-second skip had happened. Same corrupted pixels, same washed-out frame. 2:03 a.m., exactly like the night before. When I stepped outside to look at the roof again, the gray patch seemed slightly larger. Or maybe I was just imagining it. Either way, every time I walk past that part of the yard now, I feel the same faint sense of pressure in my ears. Like something had been there and maybe hadn't completely left. I was almost asleep when it happened. Not fully out, but in that half-dreamy drifting space where thoughts stopped making sense. My room was dark, except for the faint glow from the street lamp outside, just enough to outline the furniture. The heater had kicked off an hour earlier, leaving the air cool and still. I remember lying on my side, eyes half closed, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Then the room brightened a little. So softly that at first I thought it was just a car passing on the street. But the light didn't come from the window. A thin, faint line of pale light traced across the ceiling, starting near the corner above my dresser. It moved slowly, smoothly, almost like someone was dragging a dim flashlight beam along the paint. Except it wasn't reflected light. It looked like the ceiling itself was glowing where the line passed. By the time my brain registered that something was wrong, the line had already traveled halfway across the ceiling. I tried to sit up, but my body lagged behind my instinct, like waking from a deep sleep even though I'd barely drifted off. The light continued gliding toward the opposite wall. It didn't flicker or waver. It looked deliberate, as if following a path. Just before I managed to push myself up on my elbow, the line faded. Not all at once, like it dissolved into the ceiling, thinning until it disappeared completely. I sat there in the dark, breathing hard, staring at the blank ceiling. The glow hadn't been bright enough to hurt my eyes or cast shadows, but it had definitely been real. The room wasn't any lighter now, which somehow made it worse. It felt like the light had never been there and yet had left something behind in the air. A static tension. I waited, listening. Nothing. After a minute or two, I got out of bed and turned on the light. Everything looked normal. No cracks in the ceiling, no reflections, nothing out of place. I even pulled a chair over and checked the surface up close. Smooth drywall, no marks, no residue. I told myself it had to be headlights from a passing car. But I'd lived in that house for 3 years, and I knew how headlights looked inside. They came in arcs, broken by blinds or window frames. They didn't form a perfect, narrow line that moved across the ceiling like it was following a ruler. I turned off the light again and got back in bed. I didn't fall asleep, though. I kept staring upward, waiting for another line, another glow. My eyes hurt from staying open too wide in the dark. Around 10 minutes later, something in the room changed. Not visually. Nothing moved. But the air shifted, like the pressure in the room thickened. My ears felt slightly plugged. And there was this low hum under everything. Not a noise exactly. More like a vibration deep enough that I felt it in my chest. I held my breath. The hum grew a little stronger, then steadied. The room felt heavier, like the space around me was being compressed. I don't know how else to describe it. Then the light returned. This time it was even fainter, just a soft glow tracing part of the ceiling near the corner. A short line, not the long sweep from before. It moved a few inches, then paused. For a moment I thought it was forming a shape, but it never connected into anything recognizable. It just hovered there, a thin, glowing line. The air felt almost electric. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to try to record it. The second my fingers brushed the screen, the light vanished. The hum in the air cut out at the exact same moment, leaving the room in complete stillness. When I turned on the phone, the time made me freeze. 12:43 a.m. I checked the clock on the wall. 12:32. The clocks had been synced 2 days earlier after a power flicker. I knew they matched. Somehow my phone had jumped ahead 11 minutes, or something in the room had made time feel shorter than it was. I got up and walked through the house, kitchen, hallway, bathroom, turning on lights just to have something steady and normal to look at. Everything was fine. Nothing was out of place. But every room felt slightly off, like the temperature shifted a few degrees from one step to the next. Not warmer or colder, just inconsistent. I went outside onto the back patio, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. The night was calm, no wind, the sky was overcast, the clouds faintly glowing from the town lights. But above my house, directly above it, there was a single small break in the clouds, a circle of darker sky. No stars visible, but an opening big enough that it looked intentional. I stared at it until my eyes watered. The opening stayed perfectly still while the rest of the clouds drifted around it. Slowly, over the course of maybe 20 seconds, the circle closed as the clouds slid across it, almost reluctantly, like something underneath was letting go. And when the sky looked normal again, I went back inside. I didn't try to sleep. I lay on the couch with the lights on, watching the ceiling, ready to see the faint line again. It didn't happen, but every now and then the room felt like it tightened or loosened around me, like the air pressure was shifting in tiny, uneven waves. Around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally got the better of me, and I drifted off. When I woke up just after sunrise, everything looked completely ordinary. Ceiling normal, phone clock matching the wall clock again. No strange sensations left over. But the faint memory of that line, not bright, not dramatic, but impossibly smooth and controlled, stayed with me the entire day. Not just the line itself, but the way it moved with a purpose, like it was scanning or observing something I couldn't see. That night, before going to bed, I turned off the lights and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Nothing happened. But as I closed my eyes, I could almost feel the room tighten just slightly, like whatever had passed through wasn't entirely gone, like it was waiting for the right moment to trace the ceiling again. I was taking a late walk around my neighborhood, something I'd been doing more often since I started working from home. It was close to midnight, cool enough that I could see my breath, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. The houses on my street are spaced out, single-story ranch-style places with big front yards and barely any streetlights. It always felt safe, quiet, predictable. That night felt normal at first. I remember hearing a dog bark a few streets over and someone's wind chime clinking softly. The air smelled like pine and chimney smoke. I walked with my hands in my hoodie pockets, following the sidewalk past the Miller place, then the old brick house that's been empty for years. When I rounded the corner onto Ledgewood Drive, the neighborhood opened up a little. Fewer trees, wider yards, clearer view of the sky. I don't know why I looked up then, probably the way the moonlight hit something, but I did. That's when I saw it. A pale orb hovered above a rooftop about 2 blocks away. Not high in the sky, just maybe 20 or 30 feet above the shingles. It wasn't bright, it wasn't glowing like a lamp or a drone. It looked more like a soft, diffused sphere of light, the way fog sometimes glows around a street lamp, except there was nothing to illuminate it. It just hung there, perfectly still. I stopped walking without thinking. My brain tried to categorize it. A drone, maybe? A reflection? A security light? But it wasn't throwing any light onto the roof below. It wasn't flickering. It didn't strobe like aircraft lights. It looked self-contained. I stepped closer, moving slowly down the sidewalk, trying not to blink. The orb didn't react. It just existed there over the roofline of a dark house I didn't recognize. I didn't see any movement inside, no porch lights, nothing. As I got closer, the silence hit me. The dog barking earlier had stopped, the wind chimes too. Even the sound of distant cars was gone. It felt like someone had sucked all the noise out of the night. My footsteps on the pavement sounded too loud, too sharp. I slowed down again. The orb stayed exactly where it was, maybe the size of a basketball, maybe a little bigger. The light didn't spread. It was confined to that sphere, pale and even like the color of a dim LED. Then it dimmed slightly, just a subtle shift, but enough for me to notice. It was like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch, not abruptly, but with intention. I froze, half hidden behind a mailbox. The orb continued to dim, but it didn't shrink or drift. It didn't fall or rise. It just became fainter in place, like it was dissolving into the darkness. Then, for a moment, it stabilized, still visible, but barely. I held my breath. A few seconds passed, maybe 10. Then the orb dimmed again, this time faster, until it looked no brighter than a faint smudge of moonlight, and then it was gone. No movement, no streak, no sound, just gone, as if someone had erased it from the air. I waited where I was, listening. Still nothing. After a moment, the normal sounds returned. A car engine in the distance, a gust of wind moving through leaves, a porch light buzzing. It all came back at once, like the neighborhood had been paused. I stepped slowly toward the house where the orb had been. The air felt colder near it. Not freezing, just enough to notice. The house itself looked completely ordinary. 2 windows, shut curtains, no lights on. I didn't recognize the car in the driveway, but I don't pay attention to neighbors' cars much. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at the spot where the orb had hovered. There was nothing there now, just a blank patch of night sky. For some reason, I checked my watch. 12:08 a.m. I glanced at my phone. 11:57 p.m. I frowned. My watch isn't digital. It doesn't resync itself. I'd wound it earlier that day, and it had been accurate. Somehow it had jumped ahead 11 minutes. I walked home faster than I meant to. Every tree shadow felt off, like they were slightly out of place. I kept glancing up at rooftops, half expecting to see another pale orb resting above them. Nothing else appeared. When I got back into my house, the air inside felt warmer, normal. The heater kicked on. The refrigerator hummed. The dull buzz of the street lamp outside drifted through the window. But when I checked my watch again, it still read 12:08, even though my phone now said 11:59. The next morning, my watch had corrected itself. Or maybe corrected isn't the right word. It drifted back to the right time, minute by minute, until it matched my phone exactly. Like whatever had happened wasn't permanent. I walked past that house again later that day. It looked even more ordinary in daylight. Fresh paint, trimmed hedges, nothing weird about it at all. But I kept glancing at the roof. I didn't see anything. Still, when night came again, I closed the blinds a little tighter than usual. And before I went to bed, I checked all the clocks in the house, twice, just to make sure none of them had jumped ahead on their own. They hadn't. But around midnight, for a few seconds, the neighborhood went quiet again. Quiet in that same unnatural way, like the world was waiting for something to appear just above the roofs. I woke up because the house felt wrong. Not cold, not noisy, just wrong in a way that didn't match anything I could pinpoint. It was early, maybe around 4 a.m., judging by the faint bluish light coming through the blinds. I swung my legs out of bed and immediately noticed how still everything sounded. My neighborhood is usually quiet at night, but not silent. There's always something. Cars on the main road, someone's AC unit humming, a dog barking somewhere down the block. That morning, there was nothing. No sound at all. I walked into the hallway and stopped when I saw a thin sliver of light on the floor near the entryway. At first, I thought it was just the porch light leaking through the window, but then I noticed the angle was wrong. The light was coming from the front door. The door was open. Not wide, but cracked just enough to show the outline of the porch. My stomach tightened. I always lock the door. Always. I live alone, and it's a habit I don't break. Before going to bed, I'd checked it like I always do. I stood there for a few seconds, holding my breath, listening for any movement inside the house. The silence was so absolute, it made my ears ring. I reached for the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight from the hallway drawer, and approached the door. The air near the entryway felt colder than the rest of the house. Not freezing, but unnaturally cool, like the temperature dipped right at the threshold. I pressed my hand against the door and pushed it shut. It swung smoothly, no resistance, no sound. The lock was still set in the locked position, which made no sense. You can't open the door from outside when it's locked, and it won't close all the way unless the lock retracts. But somehow it had been opened anyway. I checked the deadbolt. Locked. I unlocked it, opened the door fully, and stepped onto the porch. The street looked normal, but the air felt heavy. The houses across from mine were dark, no porch lights, no movement. Even the trees at the end of the block looked frozen, like there wasn't a hint of wind touching them. I walked to the edge of my driveway and looked up and down the street. No cars, no lights, not even the usual gentle buzzing from the street lamp at the corner. It was dark too, like the power to just that one pole had cut out. I listened hard, but the silence pressed in from every direction, thick enough that it felt unnatural. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. I checked my phone for the time, 4:12 a.m. No notifications, nothing unusual. When I lowered my phone, I noticed something strange on the sidewalk in front of my house. A pale patch of light shimmered faintly on the concrete. Just a soft, uneven glow, like moonlight had somehow pooled on the ground. But the moon wasn't visible. The sky was an overcast gray-blue, perfectly uniform. As I stepped closer to the patch of light, it dimmed. Not like a shadow passing over it, more like it withdrew into itself. It shrank slightly, then pulsed once, so faintly I wasn't sure I really saw it, and faded away. The concrete beneath it looked normal. I crouched down and held my hand over the spot, expecting warmth or a cold spot or something, but the temperature felt the same as everything else, just slightly chilled from the night air. When I stood up again, something made me look at the sky. A small section of it, maybe the size of a playing card if I held it at arm's length, looked subtly washed out. Not brighter, not darker, just less textured than the surrounding sky. I stared at it for several seconds, waiting for it to move or shift. It didn't. It just hung there, a faintly wrong patch above the houses, like someone had smoothed over that part of the sky with a soft brush. Then, slowly, the texture of the clouds returned. The patch blended in seamlessly until it was gone. The air around me felt different the moment it vanished. Warmer, slightly, and the silence loosened, like sound was able to exist again. A car in the distance drove along the main road. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A porch light flickered on automatically across the street. Everything resumed at once. I went back inside and shut the door firmly, checking the lock 3 times. My hand shook slightly without me meaning for it to. I stood there in the entryway, trying to figure out why the door had been cracked open when the lock was still engaged. I walked through the house, room by room, turning on lights, making sure nobody was inside. Everything was exactly the way I left it. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. But when I returned to the front door, I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. The door frame had a faint, thin line of discoloration, almost like a smear of pale dust, but only along the top half. I touched it with my fingertip. It didn't feel like dust or grime. It didn't feel like anything, just smooth wood. I looked through the peephole and scanned the street again. Everything looked perfectly normal in the early dawn light. A neighbor across the street stepped outside to get their newspaper, and I almost asked them if they'd seen anything strange, but I stopped myself. I didn't even know what I'd ask. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and kept glancing toward the front door like it might move again. As the sun came up, the shaken feeling slowly faded. The neighborhood looked the way it always did. Ordinary. Quiet, but not too quiet. Still, the moment before sunrise, when the sky turned from gray to pale yellow, I thought, just for a second, I saw that washed out patch again. High above the houses, barely visible, like something had hovered there and left an imprint too faint for anyone else to notice. And when I checked the door one more time before leaving for work, the thin smear on the frame was gone. But the air near the threshold still felt colder than the rest of the house. Cold enough that I stepped back without realizing I had. I was out behind my cousin's cabin in northern Wisconsin, lying on a cheap folding lawn chair and staring up at the sky. The cabin sits near a frozen lake, surrounded by tall pines that block most of the horizon, but there's a clearing behind the property where the trees thin out. I dragged the chair out there after dinner because the stars looked clearer than usual. The temperature was in the teens, but I'd bundled up enough that it didn't bother me. It was quiet. Not silent, just the usual winter sounds. Occasional cracking ice on the lake, a distant snowmobile somewhere far off, the soft whistle of wind moving through bare branches. My cousin Mark had already gone to bed, leaving me alone with the stars and a thermos of lukewarm tea. I wasn't looking for anything strange. I wasn't even thinking about anything in particular, just watching the sky. There was one star, brighter than the others, just above the tree line to the west. I'd noticed it earlier because it had that crisp look, the kind where it seems almost too bright for its size. I assumed it was a planet. I kept glancing at it without meaning to. At some point, maybe 20 minutes after I'd settled into the chair, that bright point started moving. Not drifting, not wobbling. It moved in a smooth, perfectly horizontal line, slow but steady, like someone had nudged it sideways. I sat up straight, thinking maybe it was an aircraft. But there were no blinking lights, no sound, no trail. Just a single bright point sliding across the sky like it was on rails. I followed it with my eyes, heart starting to pick up a little. I tried to convince myself it was nothing weird. Satellites move in straight lines, right? But this was too bright, too low. And it wasn't moving diagonally the way satellites usually do. It was almost perfectly level with the horizon. Then it stopped. Not gradually. It didn't slow down or arc upward. It just froze in place, mid-motion, like someone hit pause. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes had tricked me, but the star, if that's even what it was, remained exactly where it stopped. It hung there, unmoving, just another fixed point in the sky. I waited for it to start again, or change color, or blink, or do anything other than pretend it hadn't been gliding across the sky seconds earlier. But it didn't. Within a few moments, it became indistinguishable from every other star. I sat there staring for so long that my neck started to hurt. Nothing else moved. Nothing else flickered or hinted at being anything other than normal. When I finally tore my eyes away, the air felt heavy, thicker somehow, like breathing took just a little more effort. I pulled my scarf down and breathed the cold air directly, trying to steady myself. That's when I noticed the wind had stopped completely. Not slowed. Stopped. The trees weren't moving at all. Even the smallest twigs stood frozen in place. I didn't hear the ice shifting on the lake anymore. No engines. No distant snowmobiles. It was like the entire area had gone still in one long exhale. The hairs on my arms lifted under all my layers. I looked around, expecting an animal to burst through the woods, or Mark to come outside to check on me. Nothing moved. No lights from neighboring cabins. No headlights on the distant road. Just a vast, motionless quiet. I checked the star again, if it even was the same one. It hadn't moved. After a few minutes of that eerie stillness, sound returned all at once. A loud crack echoed from the lake. Wind pushed through the trees in a sudden gust, scattering powdery snow across the clearing. My scarf flapped against my coat like nothing had happened. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I almost packed up right then, but something made me linger. maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity. I tilted my head back again, scanning the sky for anything else out of place. The star was still there, looking completely ordinary. But as I watched, another faint point of light, farther east and much dimmer, flickered once. Not like a twinkling star, more like someone tapping a tiny flashlight behind frosted glass. Then it went out. I stayed out there longer than I intended, until the cold started creeping into my boots. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I folded the chair, took the thermos, and walked back toward the cabin. The trees felt taller on the way back, crowding in a bit more than usual. Inside, the cabin was warm, but something felt subtly different. Not wrong, just off. I checked the clock on the microwave. 11:58 p.m. My phone said 11:48. I've seen clocks drift a little before, but not 10 minutes in one night. I told myself the microwave clock must have been wrong all along, but I'd set it earlier that same evening after a brief power flicker. I stood there, staring at the mismatched times, feeling the cold from outside still clinging to my clothes. The silence from earlier echoed in my head, like I'd stepped out of the world for a moment and eased back in without knowing how. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see the sky above the trees. Everything looked normal. The stars didn't move. The wind brushed through the branches. A lone car passed on the distant road, headlights glinting faintly off the lake. I kept watching until my breath finally steadied. But even after I went to bed, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bright point of light sliding sideways across the sky, moving in a perfect, impossible line before deciding abruptly to become just another star again. And lying there, half asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw had only stopped because it knew I was watching. I was driving back from my friend Jordan's place in rural Nebraska, cutting through a stretch of county road that ran straight between open fields. It was late, around 11:30, and the sky was cloudy enough that I couldn't see any stars, just a faint orangish tint from distant towns. The fields on both sides were mostly winter stubble corn, flat and empty, except for a few irrigation rigs that looked like huge metal skeletons in the dark. I wasn't tired, just bored. I had the radio on low, more for background noise than anything. That road always felt quiet at night, but that night it felt especially empty. No other cars, no farm lights, nothing. Just a long black strip of asphalt and the reflective posts sliding by every few seconds. I first saw the glow about halfway through a long straightaway. It wasn't bright, more like the dull orange you see from a street lamp through fog, but it didn't flicker or spread. It was just floating low over the field to my right, maybe 20 or 30 feet above the crops. At first, I thought it was the light from a tractor or a harvester, but it wasn't moving horizontally. It just hovered there, steady and round, like someone had suspended a lantern in midair. I slowed a little without thinking, not enough to be obvious, just enough to get a better look. The glow had no shape around it, no visible object, no frame, no pole, nothing holding it up. It didn't illuminate the rows of dead corn beneath it. The crop stayed totally dark, like the light wasn't projecting outward at all, just glowing in place. I rolled down the passenger window a couple inches, expecting to hear a motor or see dust kicking up, anything that would explain it. But there was nothing. The air was cold and still. As I got closer, the glow didn't drift or bob the way lights on equipment sometimes do. It stayed completely motionless. It reminded me of a bulb behind frosted glass, except there was no glass, just the glow itself hanging in the air. I kept driving slowly, my eyes locked on it. Then it started to rise. Straight up, perfectly vertical. No acceleration, no curve, just a steady upward movement, like it was on a track hidden in the sky. It didn't get bigger or dimmer. The brightness stayed exactly the same, even as it climbed higher. Something about that felt wrong in a way I couldn't describe. I eased off the gas even more, almost coasting, watching it lift above the field. After a few seconds, it was level with the treetops on the far edge of the property. Then it kept going, steady as ever. I expected it to fade or flicker with the clouds drifting in the sky, but it didn't. The light stayed completely uniform. Once it was maybe 100 feet up, the glow paused, just stopped rising. I realized I had stopped the car entirely in the middle of the road. No one else was around, so I didn't bother pulling over. I just sat there with the engine idling, staring. The glow hovered motionless again, the same way it had hovered over the field. I reached for my phone out of instinct, half wanting to record it, half afraid the moment I did it would disappear. But before I even unlocked the screen, the glow shifted again. It blinked, not like a sudden flash, but like a slow dimming and brightening, almost like breathing. Dim, then back to normal. Dim again, then bright to its original level. 3 pulses, maybe 4. Then, without warning, the glow narrowed, not in brightness, but in shape. It stretched upward, thinning into a vertical smear of light, like someone had pulled on it from above. It stayed like that, thin, upright, for maybe 2 seconds. Then it snapped back into a round glow. I let the phone fall into my lap. The glow, it started rising again, same speed as before, same angle, perfectly vertical. The clouds swallowed it as it went higher. But even then, I could see the faint color bleeding through the cloud layer for a moment, like the glow was pressing against the sky from underneath. And then it disappeared completely. No fade out, just gone. I sat there longer than I probably should have, listening to the engine idle and the cold wind slip into the cracked window. A few moments after the glow vanished, I heard something strange. A dull thump that seemed to come from the field. Not loud, not sharp. Just a single low vibration that I felt more than heard. It reminded me of standing near a subwoofer when someone turns it on without playing music. The crops rustled slightly, even though there was no wind. I rolled the window up and looked around the field again, scanning for headlights or farm equipment or anything that would make sense. Nothing. Total darkness except for my own headlights reflecting off the roadside posts. I checked the time on my dashboard clock, 11:47. When I looked at my phone again, it said 11:41. I stared at the 2 clocks side by side for a long moment. My car's clock had been correct earlier. I'd synced it a few days before. It wasn't the kind that jumped because of poor signal. It was manual. I forced myself to keep driving. As I approached the end of that straight stretch, I glanced back through the passenger side mirror. For a second, I thought I saw the glow again, just a faint smear of orange in the sky. I turned my head to look directly, but the sky was empty. The rest of the drive home felt off. The road seemed too quiet, too empty. Even the hum of the tires on asphalt sounded muted. When I passed a cluster of farmhouses, none of the windows were lit. It was like everyone had gone to bed early, or like something had turned the whole area down to low volume. I got home around midnight. My porch light flickered once when I unlocked the door, something it never does. Inside, the house felt colder than it should have, even though the heater was on. I checked the thermostat. It seemed fine, but the air felt still, heavy. I looked out the kitchen window toward the fields on the horizon, expecting nothing, but my eyes lingered there anyway. The sky was back to normal. A few breaks in the clouds showed faint stars here and there. I stood there until the heater finally clicked on, breaking the silence. Before going to bed, I checked the time again. The microwave said 12:04. My phone said 11:58. I didn't bother fixing them. That same night, just before I fell asleep, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. A soft vibration, not painful, just unfamiliar. It passed quickly, like a held breath being released. I got up, walked to the window, and looked outside one more time. The fields were dark, the sky was empty. But for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a pale, dull glow rising far beyond the tree line, so faint I couldn't tell if it was real or just my eyes remembering what I'd seen. Then it was gone, and everything looked exactly the way it should. The whole thing started because I couldn't sleep and ended up checking my phone at 2 in the morning. I saw a notification from my security app, motion detected in the driveway at 1:17 a.m. That wasn't unusual on its own. Raccoons, neighborhood cats, sometimes the wind pushing the trash bins. But the clip preview looked strange. Just a washed-out image, like the camera had stared directly into a flashlight. I got out of bed and walked into the living room where I had a bigger screen to view the footage. The house felt colder than it usually did at night. Not freezing, just the kind of cold that made the air feel thin. My street in suburban Oregon is usually quiet, especially on weeknights, but the silence that night felt heavier than usual. I remember standing still for a moment near the window, listening for anything, not even a car in the distance. I opened the security app again and played the clip. At first, there was nothing, just the usual grainy night vision view of my driveway, my car, the walkway, the hedges. The timestamp read 1/2/1703. The infrared looked normal, everything in that pale gray. Then the image blew out completely, washed in a white flash so bright it looked like the camera lens had exploded. No sound, just the visual whiteout. When the footage returned to normal, the timestamp jumped to 1/7/1711, 8 seconds missing. I replayed it 3 times, and every time the jump was identical. 1:17 to 1:7:11. No gap, no glitchy transition, just seamless. You blink, and the world skips. I tilted the screen toward the window and looked out at the driveway, half expecting something to be out there, but everything looked plain. The car was where it should be. The hedges barely moved in the breeze. My neighbor's porch light glowed faintly across the street, steady. I stepped closer to the window anyway. The air felt colder near the glass. I cracked it open just an inch. The outside quiet didn't feel natural. It was like all the ambient noise had been dialed down. No passing cars, no wind through the big cedar tree in my yard, not even the hum of the power lines. I closed the window and replayed the clip again, this time slowing it down frame by frame. Right before the flash hit, the hedges on the left side of the screen shifted, but not like wind, more like something moved past them without bending a single branch. A faint distortion, almost like heat shimmer, but sharper. I checked outside again and saw nothing. No footprints in the frost on the walkway. Nothing disturbed. I saved the video to my phone and walked back toward the kitchen for a glass of water. Halfway there, the house lights flickered, not like a full outage, just a short dip. The clock on the microwave reset when it happened, blinking 12. That scared me more than the flicker itself. My house hasn't had electrical issues since I moved in. When I went back to the living room, I opened the curtains all the way. If something had happened outside, I wanted to see it clearly. But the street looked untouched. Every house dark, every driveway empty, no movement anywhere. Just silence. I sat on the couch and rewound the footage to about 10 seconds before the flash. I noticed something else, just a tiny thing. The light in the top right corner, where the night sky was visible between the roof lines of my house and the neighbors, flickered. It wasn't lightning. There hadn't been storms. And it wasn't a passing plane. It was a single pulse of light, faint and bluish, like someone had turned on a bulb far behind the clouds. Then the flash hit and the timestamp jumped. I locked my front door again, even though it was already locked. I checked the back door too. I felt stupid doing it, but something in me didn't trust anything in the house to be the way I left it. I replayed the clip yet again, but this time I muted it and just watched. During the whiteout, the camera didn't freeze or stutter. It was actively recording, just blind. When it regained the image, nothing in the driveway looked different. No shadows out of place, no debris, no mist. The only thing that had changed was the time. It was almost 3 when I finally turned the TV on for background noise. The quiet had started to get to me. Even the refrigerator sounded too loud in the silence. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, call the security company, check the wiring, something rational. But when I finally tried to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about those 8 seconds. 8 seconds where something had happened right outside my house, close enough to light up the whole front yard, but not bright enough for me to see through the curtains, even though the camera was overwhelmed by it. The next morning, I went outside before work to check the driveway for anything. Scorch marks, footprints, anything. There was nothing unusual. The frost on the car windows was undisturbed, and the hedges looked normal. The ground was frozen enough that no footprints would show unless someone really stomped around, but I still checked. I even wiped my finger across the camera lens to see if maybe something had splashed on it, caused the distortion. It looked clean. The casing felt colder than the rest of the metal trim on the house, like something had chilled the surface. Before leaving, I reviewed the footage again on my phone. I noticed one more detail I hadn't caught earlier. Right after the flash and right before the timestamp jump, the camera registered a tiny flicker of motion in the far corner of the driveway, a single frame, a shape that didn't resemble an animal or a person, too round, too symmetrical. It was gone so fast I almost convinced myself it was compression noise. Almost. Work didn't distract me as much as I hoped. I kept refreshing the camera feed remotely all day. Every time a car passed or a bird landed in the driveway, my heart jumped a little. Nothing else happened, though. No flashes, no glitches. That night before bed, I stepped onto the porch and looked up at the patch of sky I'd seen flicker in the video. The air was cold but normal. No strange stillness this time. No pressure in my ears. I waited about 5 minutes, staring up at the clouds. Nothing. But when I went back inside and glanced at the security feed one last time, the timestamp did something subtle, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. It paused for a fraction of a second, like a hiccup, not enough to count as a skip, just a stutter. Then it continued as if nothing was wrong. I sat down on the couch again, suddenly wide awake. I replayed the last 10 seconds of footage to see if I had imagined the stutter. The recording played smoothly, no pause, but the live timestamp had definitely hesitated, even if it didn't show up in the saved footage. I watched the feed longer than I meant to, waiting for another glitch, another flash. The driveway stayed still, the hedges didn't move, the night looked ordinary. But those 8 missing seconds stayed in the back of my mind, sitting there like a question that wasn't meant to be answered. And even now, sometimes when I check the live feed late at night, the timestamp hesitates for just a beat, like something out there is passing by again, just briefly enough that the camera notices even if I don't. I was on Lake Hartwell before dawn, sitting alone in my small aluminum boat with a thermos of bad coffee and a single pole propped against the side. I'd gotten there earlier than usual, around 5:10 a.m., because the weather had been weirdly warm for late March, and I thought I might get a good bite before the sun came up. The lake was completely calm, a glassy sheet of dark water stretching out toward the tree line. There was no wind, no insects, no boat motors in the distance. Just the quiet hum of the boat rocking gently whenever I shifted my weight. The sky was pitch black, except for a faint lighter band toward the east. I dropped anchor near a narrow cove where my friend Tyler had told me he'd caught a decent bass the week before. It was the kind of spot where you feel alone in a comfortable way. Empty water, birds still sleeping, nothing but space to think. I remember leaning back and listening to the oar handles rattle slightly against the metal frame. The moment felt normal. Then I noticed the reflection. It was faint at first, just a soft glow on the surface of the water directly ahead of me, maybe 15 or 20 feet out. It looked like moonlight, except the moon wasn't out. And the sky above that patch of water was the same uniform pre-dawn darkness as everything else. The glow didn't shimmer the way reflections usually do. It didn't move with the ripples. It stayed perfectly still, a pale oval shape resting on the surface like someone had placed a dim light bulb under the water. I leaned forward, squinting. My first thought was that someone on the opposite side of the lake had turned on a bright dock light, and I was seeing the reflection before the source. But when I looked up, there was nothing. No cabins with lights on, no boats, no planes, no stars breaking through the cloud cover. The glow remained. I dipped my hand in the water just to feel for a current or temperature change. The surface was cold, normal for the season. Nothing unusual happened. When I pulled my hand back, the water dripped from my fingers, distorting the reflection for a moment. Then the glowing patch reformed instantly, like the disturbance didn't affect it at all. A few seconds passed. Then the glow brightened just slightly, just enough that it lit the underside of the thin mist drifting low over the water. That made my stomach tighten because it meant the light wasn't coming from above, it was coming from below. My first real spike of fear hit then. I remember checking the sky again anyway, as if some hidden spotlight might suddenly reveal itself. But the sky was empty, no breaks in the clouds, no beams of light. Nothing. I reeled my line in without thinking, hands shaking a little. The hook broke the surface with a tiny metallic click. The glow didn't react to the movement. I started to pull the anchor rope to bring myself closer to glow or farther away. I didn't even know what I intended. But something about the water's surface made me freeze. The glow shifted. Not the way light naturally spreads or moves through water. This was a deliberate shift, like the center of the glow slid a few inches to the left. Then it stopped. Completely. Like whatever was producing it had repositioned itself, not the reflection. The surface of the lake didn't ripple. I let the anchor rope slip from my hand. For a moment, everything went silent, even more than before. No birds, no distant highway noise, not even the soft slap of water against the boat. It was like sound itself had been pushed away from the cove. I sat perfectly still. The glow didn't change. It only waited there, bright enough now that it cast the faintest, almost imperceptible shimmer on the underside of my boat's hull. After maybe 20 or 30 seconds, though it felt longer, the light began to retract downward, slowly, smoothly, like it was sinking straight into the depths. The glow shortened, becoming more concentrated as it descended, until it was just a small circle of pale brightness deep under the surface. Then it vanished. Not faded, vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was not. The water went completely dark again. A few seconds later, sound returned abruptly. A fish jumped somewhere behind me. A breeze pushed across the lake. The mist began to move again. It was like the whole cove had been holding its breath. I waited. I didn't move. I just listened, half convinced the glow would return or something would rise from the water where it had been. But the lake looked normal again, the surface perfectly flat except for the gentle drift of my boat. I considered calling Tyler or anyone who might be awake, but I felt strange, like speaking would break whatever fragile balance had returned to the world. Eventually, I pulled the anchor up, moving slowly, trying not to make noise, even though the world had already brought noise back. The metal rope scraped against the boat and sounded impossibly loud. I rowed part of the way back to the launch before I trusted myself to start the motor. Even starting the motor felt wrong, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. Halfway across the lake, I looked over my shoulder. The cove was barely visible in the dim morning light, just a dark notch between trees. Nothing glowed. Nothing moved. But the water in that direction was smoother than the rest of the lake, as if the breeze refused to touch it. Back at the launch, I tied the boat to the dock with clumsy fingers. I kept glancing down at the water around the pilings, checking for anything unusual. No glow, just murky green depths. When I finally got home, the clock on my microwave read 6:41 a.m. My phone read 6:32. I checked again 10 minutes later. Both clocks matched at 6:52. I didn't fish again for 2 weeks. When I did return to Lake Hartwell, I avoided the cove entirely. I stayed near the open water, close enough to the public docks that I could hear cars on the nearby road. But every now and then, usually right before dawn, I catch myself scanning the surface for a glow that shouldn't exist, one that lights the water but not the sky. And I always check the time twice. I was camping alone in the Allegheny National Forest, not far from Marionville. I'd gone up for a weekend because work had been a mess, and I needed a break. Nothing extreme, just a small solo trip with a borrowed 2-person tent, a cooler of simple food, and one of those cheap, folding camp chairs. I picked a quiet spot near a creek, far enough from the road that I couldn't hear passing cars, but close enough that the hike back wouldn't be annoying. By the time I finished setting everything up, the sun was already low behind the ridge. The weather was cool, maybe mid-50s, and the air felt damp like it might rain later. I got a small fire going and made dinner on my portable stove, just normal camping stuff. I wasn't expecting anything weird. I never go looking for that. Around 10 p.m., I was sitting by the fire listening to the insects, layers and layers of them. Crickets, some kind of clicking beetles, maybe cicadas still hanging on from summer. It all blended into the usual forest background noise. I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking how nice it was that nothing demanded anything from me. Then everything stopped. Not gradually. It was instant. 1 second, the forest was buzzing like normal, and the next, there was nothing. Complete silence. Not even the creek sounded right. It kept flowing, but the sound seemed muted, like someone had turned the volume down. I sat up straight, the kind of reaction you have when you hear a branch break or something moves close to your tent. But this wasn't movement. This was absence. The forest felt hollow in a way I'd never experienced. I listened hard, waiting for something, an owl, a rustle, even the snap of a twig. Nothing. My breathing felt too loud, like it didn't belong in that quiet. Then I noticed something between the trees off to my right. At first it looked like heat distortion, the same kind you get above asphalt on a hot day, but it wasn't hot. The air was cool enough that my breath had a faint fog to it. The distortion wasn't rising from the ground either. It was hovering at about chest height, maybe 20 feet away. A faint shimmer, moving slowly. Not bright, not glowing. More like a patch of air that wasn't behaving correctly. A subtle ripple, shifting sideways between the tree trunks. I leaned forward, trying to see if maybe a small animal was crossing in front of my lantern or firelight, making some odd shadow effect. But the shimmer didn't match any shape. It didn't cast a shadow or reflect anything. It drifted in a straight line for maybe 5 or 6 feet, then stuttered, as if the air rippled twice in place and began to fade. I didn't move. I don't even think I blinked. The shimmer dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing but the silhouettes of trees. For several seconds after it disappeared, the silence stayed. No insects, no wind, nothing. The fire crackled faintly, but even that sounded restrained, like the forest was swallowing the sound. My first stupid thought was that a car's headlights had caused some kind of reflection from behind me. I turned and looked through the trees toward the direction of the forest road. Pitch black. No light. No engine noise. I knew immediately that explanation didn't make sense. Then the insects came back. The way they returned was weird. Instead of gradually building, they snapped back on all at once. An abrupt flood of noise. It startled me more than the silence or the shimmer had. One moment I was alone in a dead forest, and the next it was like nothing had happened. I let out a breath without realizing I'd been holding it. I forced myself to get up and walk a slow circle around the campsite with my flashlight. The beam lit the leaves, the ferns, the edges of the creek. Everything looked normal. No prints, no animals, no movement. But every time I swept the light across the area where I'd seen the shimmer, the beam seemed to dull slightly, like the air swallowed a bit of it. I tried to convince myself it was fog starting to form or some trick of humidity, even though it wasn't foggy. When I got back to the fire, I checked my phone out of habit. The screen said 10:42 p.m. The last time I checked the time before the silence, it had been 10:33. 9 minutes. It didn't feel like 9 minutes. It felt like maybe 2 or 3, tops. I'd barely shifted in my chair. The fire hadn't burned down noticeably. My coffee wasn't cooler. Nothing matched the amount of time that supposedly passed. I sat by the fire for a long time after that, listening to the insects and trying to relax. Every now and then I thought I heard the silence trying to creep back in. Tiny dips in volume that lasted less than a second. But maybe that was just my nerves. Around midnight, clouds moved in and the temperature dropped fast. I got into the tent to try to sleep, but I kept my lantern on low just in case. Every rustle of the nylon sounded too close. The insects outside were steady again, but the pauses between their calls stuck out more now, like I was waiting for the next full stop. Sometime around 1 a.m., I heard a soft vibration. Not in the ground, in the air, like the hum you get from a distant transformer station, but gentler and shifting pitch slightly. I froze in my sleeping bag, listening. The vibration didn't get louder or closer, it just passed through the area like a breeze you can't feel but can somehow hear. Then it faded. The insects never stopped this time. I didn't sleep much. When dawn came, pale and blue through the tent fabric, I stepped outside to check the area again. The forest looked ordinary. The air felt normal. Birds were waking up in the distance. But where I'd seen the shimmer, the ground felt colder. Not by much, maybe a few degrees. Enough that the dew there hadn't formed the way it had everywhere else. The leaves in that small patch were dry. I packed up quickly, not because I was terrified, just because the place felt wrong in a subtle, hard-to-describe way, like I wasn't supposed to stay any longer than I had. Back at my car, I checked the time again. My dashboard clock said 7:03 a.m. My phone said 6:57. I stared at the two clocks for a long moment. 6 minutes difference. They'd been synced the day before. When I drove out of the forest road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another shimmer sliding between the trees. I never did. But even now, when I go camping with friends, there's always a moment, usually after the fire dies down, when I catch myself listening for the sound of every insect stopping at the exact same time. And every time I check my phone twice. I first heard the sound just after midnight. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, trying to wind down after a long day. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet you get in older neighborhoods where most people go to bed early and the closest highway is miles away. I live in a small two-bedroom place in the outskirts of Eugene. Nothing fancy, just an old rental with creaky floors and thin windows. At first, I thought the noise was coming from the heater. It was a low hum, steady and smooth, not mechanical in the normal sense. More like the vibration you feel when a big truck idles nearby, but softer, deeper, and not something I could pinpoint to any appliance. I put my phone down and sat up. The hum didn't fluctuate, it didn't click or buzz or do anything that would make sense for a household system. It just pulsed gently through the air, too even to be anything inside the house. After a few seconds, I realized something was off. The vibration wasn't coming through the floor or walls. It felt like it was pressing downward from above, as if the ceiling itself was humming. I got out of bed and stood in the middle of the room. The sound didn't get louder or softer when I moved. It just hung there, everywhere and nowhere. I walked down the hallway, passing the bathroom and the spare room. The hum stayed the same no matter where I went. I put my ear against the wall. Nothing. I pressed my hand against the floor. Nothing. The vibration wasn't inside the structure at all. It was above it. I went to the living room and turned off the lamp to listen better. The hum was faint but impossible to ignore. A low, dense tone that seemed to sit just below the threshold of normal hearing. It vibrated in my chest more than in my ears. I checked the microwave clock. 12:24 a.m. I didn't know why, but something made me check my phone too. 12:19 a.m. I stared at the two clocks for several seconds before I even processed what I was seeing. The microwave clock tends to drift a little, but not 5 minutes, and not backward or forward in sudden jumps. I tapped the phone screen again to refresh it. Still 12:19. The hum pressed a little harder then, or maybe my nerves made it feel that way. I walked to the front door and put my hand on the knob, half expecting the vibration to be warm or electric. It wasn't, it felt normal. The moment I opened the door, the hum stopped. Instantly. Not faded, not dialed down, just cut off like someone snapped their fingers. The silence outside hit me in a way that made the hair on my arms lift. The street was dead quiet. No cars, no wind, not even the distant hum of the transformer at the end of the block. It was as if every background noise in the neighborhood had been muted. I stepped onto the porch and looked up. The sky was cloudy, thick, uniform clouds reflecting that orange glow you get from city lights bouncing off them. Nothing moved. No gaps, no shifting shapes, no planes, just a still blank ceiling of clouds. But something felt wrong. It wasn't visual. It was like the air above the house had a weight to it that the rest of the street didn't. I walked down the steps into the front yard, trying to get a wider view. The grass was cold under my bare feet. I glanced around at the neighboring houses, two of them dark, one with a porch light on. Nothing unusual. I tilted my head again, staring up at the cloud cover. I kept expecting to hear the hum return or see something slip between the clouds, but the sky stayed motionless. Then the insects stopped. That was the moment I realized how unnaturally quiet everything had become. Usually, even at night, there are crickets or those faint chirps from whatever lives in the shrubs, but the whole block was silent now in a way I'd never heard before. I turned around to look at my house. It looked normal. Porch light glowing, windows dark, but the air above it felt thicker, denser, like heat haze without the heat. A soft, momentary dip in pressure made my ears pop. Not like altitude change, more like walking into a room that's been sealed too long. I froze. 5 or 6 seconds passed where nothing happened. The world stayed completely still, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. Then the hum returned, but not fully. It was faint, distant, like something moving farther away overhead. I looked up and scanned the clouds again. No shapes, no glowing, no shadows, but the hum drifted for a moment, left to right, then slightly behind me, before fading completely. This time it didn't stop abruptly. It thinned out, dissolving into the quiet, until I wasn't sure if I was imagining the last trace of it. When I finally stepped back inside, the house felt warmer, almost too warm. I checked the thermostat, normal. I checked the microwave clock again, 12:29 a.m., and my phone, 12:23. I didn't know which one to trust. I just stood in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum, the only normal sound in the world right then. I walked room to room, checking windows, touching walls, listening for any vibration. Everything felt normal again. No lingering hum, no weird pressure, no shifting sounds. But when I lay back down in bed, the quiet felt wrong in a new way, like the house was waiting. I eventually fell asleep, but lightly, the kind where every creak jolts you awake. Around 3:40 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not from a noise, but from the lack of one. I sat up and listened. No hum, no silence shift, no pressure change, just nothing. The next morning, both clocks were synced again, down to the minute. I didn't touch either of them. But that night, before I went to bed, I paused at the front door and listened carefully to the ceiling above me, half expecting that low hum to return, pressing down through the roof. It didn't. But the air felt heavier than normal, like something had passed close by and might again. I was fishing off a narrow dock on Lake Monona, the kind near the bike path where the shore lights don't reach the water. It was early August, humid enough that my shirt stuck to my back, and the sky was hazy from wildfire smoke drifting in from somewhere out west. I'd gone out late, around 11:30, because the day had been loud and crowded, and I just wanted a quiet place to sit. The lake was almost completely calm. No breeze, no waves, barely even the small ripples from the bluegill moving under the surface. I had a small lantern clipped to my tackle box, but it didn't throw much light. Mostly I was sitting in the dark with my line hanging straight down and the occasional mosquito whining past my ear. Nothing strange happened at first. I caught one small bass and let it go. I listened to some distant music coming from one of the houses across the water. A car door slammed somewhere far off. A couple minutes passed where everything was totally silent. Then the water changed. It didn't glow or boil or anything dramatic. It just smoothed out. The ripples flattened like something heavy pressed them down. The whole surface took on this faintly reflective quality, like black glass. I could see the blurred shape of the trees behind me, the lantern's glow, even the angle of the dock posts, almost like I was standing over a mirror instead of a lake. I leaned forward, thinking the wind had died completely, and that was all it was. But my reflection didn't look right. The lantern light was steady, dim, and warm. But on the lake's surface, it had a second reflection that floated a little to the left of where the real lantern sat. This second reflection wasn't warm. It was this faint bluish-white shimmer, and it moved slightly, drifting across the water's surface even though nothing above the water was moving. I frowned and turned the lantern off just to see what would happen. The real reflection disappeared. The dim blue one didn't. It stayed on the water, moving slowly, like something drifting in the reflection of a boat light. The weirdest part was that when I looked up at the spot where the light should have been, there was nothing. Just hazy night sky and faint shoreline shadows. I stepped closer to the edge of the dock. The reflection slid sideways. Not fast, just a gentle drift, like someone pulling a flashlight beam through fog. It traced along the smooth surface of the lake, leaving a faint trail of brightness behind it before that faded too. I tried to convince myself there was a boat out there with a weird LED light, but I didn't hear anything, not even the soft slap of water against a hull. The lake was too quiet for anything to be moving around unnoticed. My fishing line tugged suddenly. Not a bite, more like something brushed against it. The bobber didn't move at all. It just rested on top of that strange, glossy water, almost unnaturally still. Then the reflection brightened. Barely, but enough that I took a step back. It stretched as though the light source had elongated. The shape wasn't circular anymore. It was more like a faint oval with a blurred edge. The pull on my fishing line tightened, and I reeled in slowly, expecting to feel weeds or a large fish. The line came up clean. I looked back at the water. Now there were two faint reflections. Not identical, one slightly brighter, drifting at a different angle. They moved in slow, smooth arcs, like two dim shapes passing each other in a mirrored world. Above the lake, nothing. I checked behind me, thinking maybe a bike or jogger's headlamp was causing it, but the path was empty. The houses across the lake were dark except for a porch light or two. No boats, no drones, no aircraft. The reflections moved closer to the dock. I crouched down to get a better look. Up close, the water didn't just look reflective. It looked thick, almost like oil. I could see my face in it, fainter than normal, elongated slightly, as if the angle of the reflection wasn't quite correct. My own eyes looked offset by a fraction of an inch. The brighter of the two dim lights drifted right over the place where my reflection's head was. On the water's surface, in the reflection, it looked like a small glowing object passing above me, but I felt nothing. No warmth, no breeze, no sound. Above the lake there was still only darkness. The second reflection drifted farther out, then stopped completely. So did the first. Both glowed faintly in place. The cold feeling hit me then, not a temperature drop exactly, but the sensation that the air wasn't moving around me, like the lake was holding its breath. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly slipping on the dock, and pulled it out. The screen was on, even though I hadn't touched it. The time read 2:44 a.m. I knew that right. I'd only been there maybe 20 minutes, and it was barely past midnight when I started. I hit the home button. The screen flickered, then went black. The phone rebooted itself. When the screen lit back up, the reflections vanished. Not faded, gone instantly, like someone snapped their fingers. The water rippled again, as if released from whatever held it still. The reflective quality disappeared. My fishing bobber bounced on the surface. Everything went back to normal so abruptly I almost doubted I'd seen anything at all. Then my phone finished booting. The time said 1:07 a.m. Normal. Battery at 72%. No notifications. Just the sudden, unsettling sense that something had reset itself. I turned the lantern back on. The beam looked weak at first, then steadied. I checked the shoreline again, the sky, the water, nothing unusual. The hazy stars were exactly where they belonged. The distant houses were quiet. But the dock felt different. Not physically, just in the way you sense someone has left a room a moment before you walk in. A kind of absence heavy enough to notice. I reeled in my line, packed my gear, and walked off the dock faster than I meant to. I didn't hear anything behind me, no splash, no movement, but halfway to the car, I stopped and looked back. The lake surface was normal again. Except in the reflection of one of the house's porch lights, I saw a faint drifting glow that didn't match anything in the air. Just a soft smear of light sliding sideways across the water. When I looked directly at the spot above it, there was only darkness. I didn't stay to see if it moved again. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove home with the radio off the whole way. I didn't go fishing at night again for a long time after that, and I was sitting on my back porch in Willow Creek, the little town outside Bend, where I rent a duplex that used to be a vacation home. It was around 10:30 p.m., early October, one of those nights where the cold felt clean and the air smelled faintly like sap from the pines behind the property. I'd brought out a mug of lukewarm tea I wasn't really drinking, just holding for the heat. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. It had been a long workday, and staring at the tree line was easier than looking at my phone again. The forest behind my place is dense enough that even in daylight it feels like it absorbs sound. At night, it's just a darker wall of nothing. That's when I noticed the light. It was faint, almost too faint to distinguish from the sky at first. But once I focused on it, I realized it wasn't a star. It hung just above the treetops, a soft, muted glow like someone had placed a lantern about 20 feet above the forest. Not bright enough to light anything, just bright enough that it looked out of place. It didn't flicker, didn't drift. It was perfectly still. I remember leaning forward in the chair, trying to decide if there was a logical explanation. A drone, maybe. People use them around here, especially on weekends. But drones have distinct lights, red, green, or white, and they blink. They also make noise. Even from a distance, they hum. This didn't. It just hovered there, quiet and steady, like it had been waiting for me to look at it. I watched it for several seconds, thinking maybe it would move or fade or brighten, anything. But it stayed exactly the same. A tiny, pale orb suspended above the trees. I stood up and walked to the porch railing. Still no movement. No sound. Not even a change in the way the branches below it looked. The light didn't illuminate the treetops like it should have if it were actually above them. It was more like it existed on its own layer, separate from everything around it. I remember thinking, in a very clear but uneasy way, that nothing should be that still. I took a few steps down into the yard, which was barely lit by a motion light near the garage. From that angle, I could tell the light sat slightly east of the house, close enough that if it were attached to something tall like a tower or construction crane, I'd know about it. Willow Creek doesn't have anything taller than 2 stories. The glow held steady, no change at all. Then, without warning, it began to dim. Not abruptly, not like something switching off. It faded gradually, the way a dimmer switch lowers a bulb. But there was no trail, no downward drift, no sound accompanying it. It just lost brightness, slow and smooth, until it became a faint smudge, then nothing at all. The sky looked completely normal once it was gone. Stars where they always are. No clouds, no sign anything had ever been there. I waited another minute or so, scanning the tree line, expecting it to reappear. Instead, the air pressure shifted slightly. My ears tightened for a second, enough to make me swallow automatically. Then it went away. The forest remained silent. At that point, I told myself it was time to go inside. But something stopped me, not fear exactly, just confusion. I wanted to understand what I'd seen before I retreated indoors. I walked to the edge of the yard until my shoes touched the first layer of pine needles. That's when I heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of one. The crickets had stopped. The wind in the branches fell completely still. Even the distant hum from the highway, usually present if you really listened, had gone silent. It was like the entire environment hit pause. I didn't move for a good 20 seconds. The yard light buzzed faintly behind me, but that was the only noise. Then, all at once, the normal sounds returned. Crickets, the faint rustling of branches, a dog barking somewhere down the road. It happened so abruptly that it made the hair on my arms rise. I backed up toward the porch, keeping my eyes on the tree line in case the light came back. It didn't, but as I reached the steps, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Just a short vibration, not a call or text. When I took it out, the screen was blank. No notifications, no missed anything, just the lock screen. The time had jumped ahead 4 minutes. Not enough to be alarming on its own, but enough that I knew it was wrong. I had checked the time earlier when I went outside, and only a couple minutes should have passed. I chalked it up to my phone glitching, though it had never done that before. I went inside, locked the door, and looked out through the sliding glass window next to the kitchen. The trees were still. The sky looked normal. The kind of normal that felt overly normal, like I was looking at a picture instead of something real. I tried watching TV but couldn't focus. I'd glance out the window every couple of minutes, waiting for a flash or glow or anything to break the darkness. Nothing did. What stuck with me wasn't the light itself, it was the way it faded, controlled, deliberate, like someone dimming a studio lamp. And the silence, total, swallowing silence, right afterward. A week later, out of curiosity, I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Halpern, if she'd noticed anything strange lately. She's in her 70s, but sharp as anyone I know. She frowned a bit and said she'd seen a weird star sitting too low a few nights ago, but assumed it was her eyes. She mentioned it vanished like it was never there. She didn't seem bothered, just confused. I didn't tell her what I saw. I figured it wouldn't help either of us. Since then, I still sit on the porch sometimes, but I never let myself zone out the way I did that night. I always end up watching the tree line, waiting for a pale glow to appear again. It hasn't, but sometimes, right before the porch light clicks on, automatically, the air goes silent in a way that makes me hold my breath, just for a second, thinking maybe the dimming is about to start again. I woke up before my alarm, which almost never happens. It wasn't a sudden jolt or a nightmare, just that quiet, uneasy kind of waking, where your mind surfaces slowly, but your body feels like it's been on alert for a while. The first thing I noticed was the room felt different. Not brighter, not louder, just changed. The air felt warm on one side of me, like the window had been letting in heat, which didn't make sense because it was mid-November and the nights had been cold enough to frost the edges of the glass. I rolled over and saw the blinds near the window were open by maybe 2 or 3 inches. I always close them, every night. I've been like that since I moved into the apartment in Larchwood. The window faces a parking lot shared with the building next door, and I don't like waking up to headlights or morning brightness. Closing them is almost muscle memory at this point, but now they were open just enough to create a thin slice of visibility. And the air coming from that gap was warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, but wrong for the season and wrong for 4:30 in the morning. I sat up slowly, listening. The apartment was silent. The fridge had its usual hum. The upstairs neighbor wasn't moving around, and I didn't hear any cars outside. It was that deep, early morning quiet where even your breathing sounds too loud. I swung my legs off the bed and started walking toward the window. The floor felt normal, cold, the way laminate gets overnight. But the closer I got to the window, the warmer the air became. Not like a heater. The warmth was uneven, drifting, almost like standing near a sidewalk after a hot day. I put my hand near the blinds without touching them. The air on my palm felt like someone had been holding something warm right outside the glass minutes earlier. Not hot enough to leave a mark, but unmistakably warm. I pulled the blinds open another inch. The parking lot looked totally normal. One street lamp flickered the way it always did. A single car was parked under it. Same blue sedan I'd seen for weeks that belonged to a guy 2 doors down. Nothing else. No movement. The sky was still dark, the kind of pre-dawn gray blue that doesn't show any detail. I pressed my hand lightly to the window. The glass was cool, not warm at all. Whatever heat I'd felt wasn't coming from the outside air. I stepped back and just stood there for a while, trying to understand why I'd woken up at that exact moment. It didn't feel random. I checked my phone on the nightstand. 4:41 a.m. No notifications. Battery at 82%, same as when I'd plugged it in before bed. I decided to get a drink of water and maybe try to sleep again. But when I walked out of the bedroom, I noticed something else. The hallway light, which I never use, was on. Dim, but definitely on. I couldn't remember turning it on at any point. I'm careful about stuff like that because the landlord is big on electricity use. I flipped it off and went to the kitchen. The sink faucet felt slightly warm when I turned it on, even though I hadn't used hot water recently. I tried to tell myself it was just leftover warmth from the pipes, but I knew that didn't make sense. The water heater isn't even on that side of the apartment. I stood there drinking water and feeling more awake, but in a way that made my skin feel too sensitive, like every sound and shift of air mattered. When I walked back toward the bedroom, I saw the light from the hallway creeping under the door, except I had just shut that light off. I pushed the door open, heart racing a bit, and saw it immediately. The blinds were now open another inch. I hadn't touched them since earlier, I was sure of it. I went straight to the window again, moving faster this time. The warm air was gone. The room felt cooler than before, almost normal. The blinds were open just enough that I could see the empty lot again. I leaned in close, trying to find some explanation. Draft, warped frame, something. But the blinds felt stiff. They didn't slide easily. There was no way they could open on their own without making noise. I tugged them up and down a bit just to check, and they squealed like they always did. No way that motion happened quietly in the middle of the night. I lowered them again and made sure they were fully closed. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the window. My heartbeat was still uneven, but not in a panicked way. More like when you're bracing for something you can't define. I lay back down and pulled the covers over myself, though I kept my eyes open for maybe 20 minutes, staring at the small outline of the window in the dark. Nothing moved. The room stayed cool. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep, because the next thing I remember was my alarm going off at 7:30. Morning light filtered softly through the blinds, still fully closed, exactly how I left them. For a moment, I wondered if the whole thing had been a dream, but when I got up to open the blinds, I felt it again. The faintest trace of warmth lingering just at the edge of the frame, as if it had soaked into the air. It faded within seconds, but I felt it. That was enough. I stayed by the window for a while, looking out at the lot, the street lamp still flickering in daylight, the blue sedan still sitting in its spot. Everything looked exactly the same as always, except the inside of my apartment didn't feel the same at all. Every night since then, I've closed the blinds carefully, making sure the slats line up perfectly, tugging the cord to lock them in place. And every morning, the first thing I do is check them. So far, they've stayed shut. But sometimes when I wake up before the alarm, I still feel that faint warmth in the air, just enough to let me know it wasn't the blinds that mattered. It was whatever was behind them,